I shall set down here an account of the events which transpired in the winter of 18, in the remote coastal village of Blackshell Cove. It is a tale not for the faint of heart, nor for those who seek neat and moral conclusions in their narratives. I commit it to paper not for fame, for I shall ensure this manuscript is hidden, but from a grim sense of duty that the memory of what occurred should not perish entirely from this earth, even if its truth is forever shrouded in the sea mists of that accursed place. I was but a peripheral witness, a young man then, sent to that desolate corner of England on a matter of family business that now seems trivial in the extreme. But what I saw, and what I heard from the lips of those soon to be silenced, has haunted my every waking hour since. It is a story of love, of hubris, and of a vengeance so cold and patient it could only have been born in the Orient. The journey to Blackshell Cove was itself a passage into melancholy. The coach, a rattling contraption of weathered wood and frayed leather, deposited me at the head of a steep, muddy track, the driver refusing to venture further on such a perilous descent, especially with a storm gathering its breath out over the gray, heaving expanse of the North Sea. I stood there for a moment, a lone figure in the gathering dusk, my portmanteau at my feet, and felt the first true chill of isolation seep into my bones. The wind, a keening dirge off the water, tore at the skirts of my greatcoat and carried with it the thick, briny stench of decay, of rotting seaweed and dead fish left to bloat upon the shingle. The track, little more than a goat path etched into the cliff face, wound its way down towards a cluster of dim, flickering lights that seemed to huddle together for warmth against the immense, indifferent darkness. Those lights were Blackshell Cove. The village appeared less a habitation of men and more a scab upon the landscape, a growth forced from the grim union of sea and stone. As I began my descent, the fine, cold rain began anew, not falling so much as hanging in the air, a palpable mist that clung to everything, to my clothes, my hair, the very lashes of my eyes. It took me the better part of an hour to navigate the treacherous path, my boots sinking deep into the cloying mud. By the time I reached the outskirts, the night had proper fallen, and the village revealed itself in fragments, glimpsed through the shifting veils of fog and rain. The cottages were squat, stone-built things with low, sagging roofs of sodden thatch, their windows shuttered tight against the elements, though from a few chinks, the sullen glow of tallow candles leaked out, doing little to push back the gloom. The only sound, beyond the constant sigh of the sea and the moan of the wind, was the mournful clanging of a bell buoy somewhere out in the hidden bay. My destination was the manor house, the seat of the local squire, a Mr. Harcourt, with whom my late father had some long-standing, obscure financial entanglement. It was this business, the sorting of papers and signatures, that served as my pretext for this wretched excursion. The manor was not hard to find. It stood upon a slight rise, a gaunt, gray silhouette against the storm-racked sky. It was a structure of the last century, built with more regard for fortification than comfort, its windows narrow and deep-set, its corners bearded with a pale, sickly lichen. I was admitted by a stooped, ancient manservant who wordlessly took my dripping coat and led me through cavernous, echoing halls. The air within was frigid, smelling of damp stone, wood smoke, and something else, something faintly sweet and cloying, the odor of slow decay. The furnishings were sparse and shrouded in dust sheets, and the portraits that lined the walls were of severe-faced men and women whose features seemed to have been carved from the same flint as the cliffs outside. Squire Harcourt received me in his study, a room where a meager fire struggled valiantly against the pervasive chill. He was a man in his late 60s, with a complexion the color of tallow and eyes that held a perpetual, watery sadness. He was polite, in a distant, weary fashion, and after the briefest of exchanges concerning the matter at hand, which we agreed to address on the morrow, he rang for the housekeeper. "Mrs. Thwaite will show you to your room," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "I fear you will find our accommodations rather plain after London. We see few strangers here in Blackshell." The way he said, "strangers," carried a weight, a subtle emphasis that did not escape me. It was a word that seemed to have a specific and perhaps ominous meaning in this place. Mrs. Thwaite was a woman as grim and weathered as the landscape. She was tall and raw-boned, dressed in unrelenting black, her gray hair pulled back into a knot so severe it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She took a candlestick from a side table and, without a word of greeting, turned and led me back into the shadowy hall and up a broad, creaking staircase. "You will be in the west wing," she stated, her voice flat and devoid of inflection. "The rooms are made up. Dinner is at 8. The squire dines alone." I followed her down a long, dark corridor, our footsteps muffled by a threadbare runner. The candle cast a small, dancing pool of light that served only to make the surrounding darkness seem more profound. It was then, as we passed a particularly dark alcove, that I felt it, a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature, a cold that was not merely of the air, but seemed to clutch at the spirit. I shivered involuntarily. Mrs. Thwaite stopped and turned, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You feel it, sir?" she asked, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in her tone, not sympathy, but a kind of grim satisfaction. "A draught," I suggested, though I knew it was more. "Aye," she said, turning to continue her march. "A draught. We get them often. This is an old house. It has its humors." She paused before a heavy oak door and pushed it open. "Your room, sir." The chamber was large and sparsely furnished. A bed with heavy hangings, a washstand, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk. A fire had been laid in the grate but not yet lit. The air was tomb-cold. Mrs. Thwaite placed the candlestick on the desk. "If that is all, sir," she said, already turning to leave. "Thank you, Mrs. Thwaite," I said. "Tell me, are there often strangers in Blackshell Cove?" She halted, her back to me, and for a long moment, she was perfectly still. When she spoke, her voice was low and cautious. "There were a pair of them last year. A young man and his wife. He was a cook, they said. Came from London." She half turned, and the candlelight carved deep hollows in her cheeks. "They're gone now." "Gone? Where did they go?" Her lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. "That is the question, isn't it, sir? One day they were here, the next, they were not. The sea gives up many secrets, and it keeps many more. Good night, sir." And with that, she was gone, her footsteps receding silently into the gloom, leaving me alone in the cold, dark room with the rain tapping against the windowpane like a persistent, unwelcome guest, and the first, faint whisper of a mystery that was to consume me utterly. The words hung in the frigid air. A pair of "They're gone now." It was my first introduction to the silence that lay at the heart of Blackshell Cove, a silence that was not empty, but filled with unspoken dread. Sleep, that night, was a fickle and reluctant visitor. The wind, which had seemed a mere lament from without, now took on a more personal character within the confines of my chamber. It whistled through invisible crevices in the stone, a thin, piping sound that put me in mind of some spectral flautist playing a dirge for the drowned. The bed hangings, heavy with the dust of disuse, stirred with a life of their own, and the shadows, cast by the single guttering candle I had kept lit, danced grotesquely upon the walls. My mind, feverish with the cold and Mrs. Thwaite's cryptic pronouncements, conjured phantoms from every rustle and creak of the ancient house. The story of the vanished couple, the cook from London and his wife, wove itself into the very fabric of the darkness, a tale without an ending, which is the most terrifying sort of all. When a pallid, gray dawn finally seeped through the leaded glass of the window, it brought little relief. The storm had abated, but a dense, woolly fog had rolled in from the sea, swallowing the world beyond my pain-hole. The village, the cliffs, the sea itself, all had vanished, leaving only the manor house adrift in a formless, soundless void. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the slow, rhythmic drip of condensation from the eaves. Descending to breakfast, I found the great hall even more sepulchral in the flat, colorless light of day. Squire Harcourt was already at the table, picking at a plate of kippers with a distinct lack of appetite. He acknowledged me with a curt nod. "I trust you rested well, Mr. Withers?" he asked, the formality of the question ringing hollow in the vast, cold room. "Adequately, thank you, Squire," I lied. "The house is very quiet." "It is that," he agreed, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the fog-shrouded window. It has been quiet for a long time. My wife, 10 years now. He did not elaborate, and I did not press. The loss seemed to hang about him like a shroud, as tangible as the mist outside. After a breakfast consumed in near total silence, the squire excused himself to attend to some estate matter, leaving me to my own devices until our business meeting in the afternoon. The prospect of whiling away the hours in that oppressive drawing room, with its moth-eaten upholstery and its air of genteel decay, was intolerable. A restlessness was upon me, a need to pierce the veil of this place, to find some substance behind the shadows. It was then I remembered the library. My father, a man of letters, had often spoken with a scholar's envy of Squire Harcourt's collection, assembled by the squire's grandfather, a man of more cosmopolitan tastes. If there was a soul to the house, I reasoned, it would be found there, amongst the thoughts and dreams bound in leather and vellum. I found the library at the end of a long, tapestry-hung corridor. The door was heavy, of dark oak, and it groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The room within was a cavern of forgotten knowledge. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with volumes, lined the walls, their leather spines cracked and faded. A thick layer of dust lay over everything, motes of it dancing in the few weak shafts of light that managed to penetrate the high, narrow windows. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of old paper, leather, and beeswax, but beneath it, too, was that same, faint, sweet odor of decay I had noticed upon my arrival. For an hour or two, I browsed the shelves, pulling out folios of natural philosophy, histories of the Roman occupation, and volumes of poetry. It was a haphazard collection, but a fine one. My fingers traced the tooled spines, seeking a distraction. It was as I reached for a heavy atlas on a high shelf that I noticed it, a seam in the woodwork that did not seem entirely natural. It was a narrow, vertical crack, almost invisible, running beside the end of a bookshelf. Intrigued, I ran my fingers along it. There was a faint, almost imperceptible give. Pressing harder, I felt a hidden mechanism yield with a soft, dry click. A small, rectangular section of the bookshelf, no wider than a folio and cleverly disguised as a support, swung inward. It was a priest hole, or perhaps merely a secret compartment for valuables. My heart beat a little faster. Within the dark cavity, something lay flat and wrapped in a piece of faded velvet. I drew it out. It was not a book, but a framed painting, about the size of a large dinner plate. Unwrapping it, I held it up to the meager light from the window. My breath caught in my throat. It was a portrait, unfinished, a sketch in oils. It depicted a young woman, perhaps no more than 20 years of age. But it was her countenance that held me transfixed. She was, in a word, extraordinary. Her hair was a cascade of the deepest, richest black, a color so profound it seemed to swallow the light, and it fell in loose waves about shoulders left bare by the décolletage of her gown. Her complexion was pale, but with a warm, creamy quality, not the sickly pallor of the local folk. And her eyes, they were large and dark, a shade of deep brown that was almost black, and they gazed out from the canvas with an expression of such poignant intelligence and melancholy that it felt less like looking at a painting and more like being observed by a living soul. There was a sensitivity in the set of her mouth, a grace in the line of her neck, that spoke of a refinement utterly alien to Blackshell Cove. This, I knew with a certainty that chilled me, was no daughter of the squire, no local gentry. This was the wife. This was Eleanor. I do not know how long I stood there, lost in those dark, haunting eyes. The portrait was clearly the work of a talented, if not yet fully matured, artist. The brushwork was passionate, hurried in places, as if the painter had been racing against time. The background was only vaguely suggested, a wash of grays and greens that could have been the moors or the sea cliffs. All the focus, all the love and attention, had been lavished upon her face. The sound of a footfall on the dusty floorboards made me start violently. I turned, guiltily, to find Mrs. Thwaite standing in the doorway, her expression as impassive as ever, but her eyes fixed upon the portrait in my hands. "I see you are a curious gentleman, sir," she said, her voice flat. She did not seem surprised, nor particularly angry. It was as if she had expected this. I found it hidden, I stammered, feeling like a schoolboy caught in a misdeed. Who is she? Mrs. Thwaite moved further into the room, her black dress seeming to absorb the scant light. She came to stand beside me and looked at the portrait, and for a fleeting moment, I fancied I saw a crack in her stony facade, a flicker of something that might have been pity, or perhaps regret. That, she said, is Miss Eleanor. Though she was a married woman. Mrs. Eleanor Corbyn. She reached out a bony, blue-veined hand and, with a surprising tenderness, traced the edge of the gilded frame. He was always painting her. The young man Thomas. Her husband. He was a cook by trade, but an artist in his soul, or so he fancied. He said the light in this place, when it deigned to appear, had a singular quality. This was painted here? In the cove. In the cottage they rented, down by the shingle. He would paint when his work for the squire was done. This one, she paused, choosing her words with care. This one he was working on just before. He must have hidden it here for safekeeping. Or perhaps he meant it as a gift for the squire and never had the chance to present it. What happened to them, Mrs. Thwaite? I asked, my voice low and earnest. You said they were gone. People do not simply vanish. She turned her head slowly, and her gaze, now devoid of any fleeting softness, was hard and sharp as flint. Don't they, sir? In a place like this? The sea claims a body most weeks. The cliffs give way in the night. The bogs on the moors can swallow a man and his horse between one breath and the next. And there are other currents. Darker things that folk here don't speak of. What darker things? I pressed. The young man, Thomas, he brought something with him. Not in his bags, but on him. A shadow. You could see it in his eyes sometimes, when he thought no one was looking. A fear that was not of the sea or the cliffs, but of something specific. Something that had followed him from London. She looked back at the portrait. She was a gentle soul. Too gentle for this world, and certainly too gentle for the shadow he dragged behind him. It is a dangerous thing, Mr. Withers, for a man to run from his past. For it has a habit of finding him, no matter how far he runs. She took the painting from my hands, wrapped it again in its velvet shroud with a funereal solemnity, and replaced it in its hidden compartment, closing the door with a definitive snap. The squire awaits you in his study for your business, sir, she said, her tone once more that of the impersonal housekeeper. It is best to let the past lie. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. And with that, she glided from the room, leaving me alone once more. The image of Eleanor's hauntingly beautiful, sorrowful face burned into my mind. The mystery was no longer an abstract whisper. It had a face, a name, and a palpable presence. A talented young cook with a secret fear, and his wife, whose beauty was as out of place in this grim cove as a rose in a quarry. And the shadow, the thing from London, that had followed them to this, the very edge of the world. Mrs. Thwaite's warning echoed in my ears, but it was already too late. The door had been opened, and I knew, with a dread and fascination that twisted together in my gut, that I could not, let it lie. My business with Squire Harcourt that afternoon was a dry, protracted affair, a matter of signatures and seals concerning a minor inheritance that had lain dormant for decades. The squire was scrupulously polite, but his mind seemed elsewhere, his attention drifting towards the fog-bound window with a weary resignation. The papers, smelling of old ink and neglect, were spread across his massive oak desk, and as we worked through them, the portrait of Eleanor Corbyn hung between us, an unspoken presence as tangible as the ledger books. I found my own focus fractured, the legalistic language blurring before my eyes, replaced by the vivid image of those dark, intelligent eyes and the cascade of jet-black hair. It was with a sense of relief that I finally affixed my own signature to the last document. The squire sanded the wet ink and leaned back in his chair with a soft sigh. "There," he said. "A matter concluded. I trust your stay in Blackshell has not been entirely disagreeable, Mr. Withers." "The landscape is formidable, squire," I replied carefully, seizing the opportunity. "And the people seem a close-knit community. Mrs. Thwaite mentioned there was a couple here last year, a cook from London and his wife. She said you employed the man. Harcourt's face, already pale, seemed to lose another shade of color. A guarded look descended upon his features, and he busied himself with straightening the papers before him. Thomas Corbyn. A talented fellow. Surprisingly so. Had a way with sauces and presentation I'd not seen outside of a London club. His wife, Eleanor, was a quiet thing. An artist. She painted. He painted her, I understand. I ventured, watching him closely. The squire's head jerked up. You know of that? It came across a sketch in the library. A remarkable likeness. He studied me for a long moment, his watery eyes searching mine. Did you? It is of no consequence now. He rose from his chair, a clear signal that the audience was over. It was a tragedy. They were a bright pair. Brought a little light into this old house. But it was not to last. What became of them, sir? I asked, refusing to be dismissed so easily. The sea, Mr. Withers, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Or the cliffs. Or the moors. This country does not suffer strangers gladly. Now, if you will excuse me, I have my rounds to make. He left me then, retreating into the gloom of the hall. His answer was the same as Mrs. Thwaites, a rehearsed, evasive generality. But he had given me a name, Thomas Corbyn. And he had confirmed the talent, the strangeness, the light they had brought. It was this very light, I suspected, that had made their subsequent extinguishing so conspicuous. Driven by a compulsion I could scarcely explain, I decided to venture into the village proper. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the cove in all its grim, sodden detail. A single, cobbled street ran parallel to a shingle beach where a handful of fishing boats lay beached, looking like the skeletons of great sea beasts. The houses were hunched and low, their stone walls green with damp. The few villagers I passed, fishermen mending nets with thick, tar-stained fingers, women in drab woolen dresses carrying buckets from the well, stopped their chatter and stared at me with open, unsmiling suspicion. Their gazes were not hostile, precisely, but deeply unwelcoming, as if I were an intruder upon a private grief. I found the inn, a low-built establishment with a faded sign depicting a leaping salmon. The salmon's leap. Pushing open the heavy door, I was met by a wave of thick, warm air, heavy with the smells of wood smoke, spilled ale, and fried fish. The conversation within, a low, guttural murmur, died instantly. Every eye in the dim, smoky room turned towards me. I took a seat at a small, scarred table near the hearth, and after a long minute, the publican, a burly man with a magnificent salt and pepper beard, ambled over. I said. He nodded, returning moments later with a tankard of a dark, cloudy brew. He made to leave, but I stopped him. I am a guest of Squire Harcourt, I began, feeling the need to establish some form of credential. I understand he employed a fine cook here last year. A Thomas Corbyn. The publican's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by the same guarded expression I had seen on the squire's face. He did. I am something of an amateur gastronome myself, I pressed on, a deliberate lie. I should be interested to know where a man of such talent learned his trade. The publican leaned in close, his voice a low rumble. Best not to be a skin after them as is gone, sir. It brings no good. The cove, it has a memory, and it don't like to be reminded. But surely, he were a good enough lad, the publican interrupted, his tone final. Kept to hisself, mostly. She were a quiet one, the missus. Pretty as a picture, but with eyes that saw things the rest of us couldn't. They're not here now. That's all there is to it. He moved away to serve another customer, effectively ending the conversation. I sipped my ale, which was surprisingly good, and felt the weight of the village's collective silence pressing in on me. It was a conspiracy of omission. Every soul in Blackshell Cove knew a story they refused to tell. It was then that a figure detached itself from the shadows in a far corner and shuffled towards my table. He was an old man, so bent with age and what I took to be a life of hard labor that he was nearly doubled over. His face was a web of deep wrinkles, and his hands were twisted with rheumatism. He wore a tattered, salt-encrusted jersey and smelled powerfully of fish and damp wool. "Ye be a skin after the Corbyns, sir?" he whispered, his voice a phlegmy rattle. He had few teeth and his breath was foul. "I am," I said, lowering my own voice. "Did you know them?" "I did for old Jeb," he said, tapping his chest. "Mended a shutter for 'em, down at the cottage. They was kind to old Jeb. Gave 'em a hot meal, they did. She, the missus, had a voice like music from far away." His milky eyes grew distant. "He were a worrier, that one. Always lookin' over his shoulder, like he expected the devil hisself to come up from the sea." "Did he say why? What he was afraid of?" Old Jeb shook his head slowly. "Nay, sir. But he talked in his sleep, he did. I heard him once, when I was workin' outside the window. Mumbled, he did, about the serpent and the price of refusal. Said he wouldn't poison no man, not for all the tea in some heathen place. China, maybe." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Poison. The word, spoken in this dank, superstitious place, had a visceral, chilling weight. It was not the fear of ghosts or fairies that had haunted Thomas Corbyn, but something far more concrete and human. A moral dilemma of the most terrible kind. "What else, Jeb?" I urged, sliding a sixpence across the table. "What happened the night they disappeared?" The old man's claw-like hand snatched the coin and vanished into his rags. He leaned in so close I could count the broken veins on his nose. "There were lights," he hissed, "down at their cottage. Not lamplight, nor candlelight. A different kind. A cold, still light. And men. Silhouettes against the windows. Men who moved quiet. Too quiet. And then just before dawn, I seen 'em on the path. 3 of walkin' up towards the headland. And one more, a 4th figure, walkin' between. Walkin', but not willin', if ye take my maning." "And Eleanor?" I asked, my throat dry. Old Jeb's face crumpled. "I didn't see her, sir. Not then. But I sees her sometimes now. Out on the cliffs, in the mist. Her black hair flowin' in the wind. She looks back towards the cottage, then out to sea. Then she's gone." He straightened up as much as his crooked back would allow, his story spent. "Don't go lookin' for that cottage, sir. There's a shadow on it. A shadow that eats the light." He shuffled away, leaving me alone with the dregs of my ale and the thunderous pounding of my own heart. The vague whispers had coalesced into a terrifying narrative. A talented cook, tormented by a past demand to poison a man. A silent, efficient abduction in the dead of night. A wife left to become a phantom of the cliffs. This was no simple tragedy of the sea. This was a story of crime and punishment, of a past that had not only followed Thomas Corbyn to this remote haven but had finally and decisively claimed him. And as I left the oppressive warmth of the inn for the biting cold of the cove, I knew with a dreadful certainty that I would disregard old Jeb's warning. I had to see the cottage for myself. The following day dawned with a brittle, crystalline clarity. The fog had been scoured away by a wind from the east, revealing a sky of pale, hard blue and a sea that chopped and glittered, cold and sharp as broken glass. The beauty was of a cruel, indifferent kind, exposing the stark, unforgiving lines of the cliffs and the meager, poverty-stricken aspect of the village with pitiless precision. My resolve, however, had solidified in the night, hardening into a singular purpose. I would find the cottage. Old Jeb's directions, procured with another sixpence and a pint of stout, had been vague, couched in the local nomenclature of the gorse path and the old saltwife's stone. Yet, after an hour of fruitless searching along the windswept headland, I stumbled upon it almost by accident. It was tucked into a small, semi-sheltered dip where the land began to fall away towards a rocky inlet, a place where the sound of the sea was not a distant roar but an intimate, crashing thunder. It was a shepherd's croft, small and sturdy, built from the same grey stone as everything else in the cove. But its desolation was absolute. The thatch roof was rotting, sagging in the middle like a tired back. The single window beside the door was a dark, vacant eye, its shutter hanging from a single hinge, tapping an irregular, mournful rhythm against the wall in the wind. A thin trickle of smoke rose from the chimney, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought it was inhabited. Drawing closer, I saw it was merely a trick of the light. A pale, sun-bleached gull's feather, caught in a draught, was dancing in the dark maw of the chimney pot. The door was not locked. It yielded to my push with a groan of protest, swinging inward to reveal a scene that froze the blood in my veins. The cottage was not empty. Nor was it in disarray. It was preserved. It was a single room, scrupulously, unnaturally clean. The stone floor had been swept. A small, rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood neatly in the center. A cold hearth held the gray ashes of a long-dead fire. On a shelf, a few tin plates and cups were arranged with geometric precision. It was as if the occupants had merely stepped out for a moment, yet the air was thick with the chill of absolute abandonment, and with that same, faint, cloying scent I had noticed in the manor, a hint of incense, of sandalwood and something else, something I could not name. It was the smell of a ritual, of a space that had been ceremoniously cleansed and closed. And on the table, placed squarely in the center as if on an altar, was a small, dark object. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached. It was a carving, no larger than a walnut. It was a tortoise, exquisitely rendered from a wood so dark it was almost black, its shell intricately patterned with what looked like swirling clouds or waves. Its head was extended, its eyes 2 tiny, inlaid points of some pale substance, mother of pearl, perhaps. It was a thing of alien, unsettling beauty. The Netsuke, the symbol of the black tortoise. A cold far deeper than the winter air seeped into my bones. This was no local superstition. This was a token, a signature. It was a message, left behind for anyone who might come looking. A message that said, "We were here. Our business is concluded." I do not know how long I stood there, staring at that small, dark totem. The tapping of the broken shutter was the only sound, a metronome counting out the silence. The cottage felt less like a home and more like a tomb, a shrine to a violence that had been so efficient it left no trace save for this profound, curated order. I fled the place, the image of that carved tortoise burning behind my eyes, its polished darkness a stark contrast to the bright, cruel day outside. It was that evening, as I took a solitary walk along the shingle beach, trying to clear my mind of the cottage's oppressive stillness, that I found him. Or rather, he found me. Thomas Corbyn was sitting on an upturned fishing boat, his back to me, staring out at the darkening sea. He was a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, with shoulders that spoke of a life of physical work, but a posture that was slumped, burdened. He wore a simple, serviceable coat, but it was of a better cut than the local garb. He turned as he heard my footsteps crunch on the stones, and I saw his face properly for the first time. It was a handsome, intelligent face, pale and drawn, with dark circles under eyes that held a world of weary fear. This was not the face of a man haunted by phantoms, but by a tangible, relentless dread. "You are the gentleman from London," he said. His voice was educated with only a trace of a London accent, confirming he was no simple cook. "I am," I replied. "Alistair Withers. You are Thomas Corbyn. I have heard something of your story." A bitter smile touched his lips. "Have you? I wonder which version. The one where we ran away to sea? Or the one where I murdered her and buried her on the moors?" "Neither," I said, sitting on a nearby rock, keeping a respectful distance. "I heard you were a talented cook, and that you and your wife brought a little light to this dark place." He looked at me, his gaze searching, assessing my sincerity. The fear in his eyes warred with a profound, desperate loneliness. The sea wind whipped at our clothes, a cold, insistent presence. "The light attracts the moths, Mr. Withers," he said softly, turning back to the sea. "And sometimes worse things." We sat in silence for a time, the only sound the relentless sigh and pull of the waves on the shingle. I could feel the confession building in him, a pressure that needed release. He was a man clinging to a precipice, and my presence, my outsider status, was a rope he was desperately considering grasping. "I worked in London," he began abruptly, his voice low, as if afraid the wind itself might carry his words to unfriendly ears. "Not in some common tavern. I was the head chef for a gentleman. A merchant. Mr. Tanaka." The name hung in the air between us, foreign and sharp. It was the first concrete piece of the puzzle, a name from the world beyond the cove. He was a Japanese gentleman, Thomas continued, almost to himself. Wealthy beyond measure. His house in Mayfair, it was like stepping into another world. Lacquered screens, floors of polished oak, silence, such a profound silence. His servants, all Japanese, moved like ghosts. They never spoke above a whisper. They never met your eye. It was a place of immense beauty and immense control. He fell silent again, gathering his thoughts, his courage. I was proud of the position. The pay was exceptional. I had creative freedom. I cooked dishes I'd only read about, using ingredients I'd never seen. For a time, it was a dream. I met her at an exhibition of her paintings. She was the only thing in that city more beautiful than Mr. Tanaka's collections. His voice softened when he spoke her name, a fleeting warmth in the gathering cold. We married. For a few months, life was perfect. He picked up a flat, gray stone and skipped it across the dark water. It bounced twice before vanishing. Then, one evening after a particularly elaborate dinner for a business associate of Mr. Tanaka's, a Dutchman, loud and red-faced, I was summoned to his private study. It was a room I had never entered. He was sitting behind a desk of some dark red wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. He was a small man, impeccably dressed, with a face that was utterly unreadable. His eyes, they were like the eyes of that carving. I started. What carving? He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his weary eyes. You know of it? The black tortoise. It is his symbol. His clan. He said the word clan, as if it were a synonym for something far darker. He was polite as always. He complimented the meal. And then he made his request. It was not a request, of course. It was a command. Thomas's hands, resting on his knees, clenched into white-knuckled fists. The wind seemed to still, as if the very elements were listening. He told me that the man who was coming to dine the following week, a silent, severe Japanese gentleman named Sato, was a business rival. He said their disagreement was irreconcilable. He placed a small, ceramic vial on the desk. It contained a white powder, odorless, tasteless. He told me to incorporate it into the ankamo, the monkfish liver dish that was to be the centerpiece of the meal. He said its effects would be slow, manifesting days later as a fever from which one does not recover. He said it was a matter of honor. The word honor sounded grotesque, obscene in this context. I refused, Thomas whispered, the words torn from him. I told him I was a cook, not a poisoner. I said I could not, in good conscience, take a life. He looked at me, his eyes wide with the memory of that momentous, foolish courage. He did not get angry. He did not threaten me. He simply nodded, his expression never changing. I understand your Western morality, he said. It is a fragile thing. I will give you until tomorrow to consider the fragility of your happiness. Your wife's paintings are quite beautiful. It would be a tragedy if something were to obscure their light. Then he dismissed me. Thomas buried his face in his hands. He didn't threaten me, Mr. Withers. He threatened her. He looked at my life, saw the one thing that gave it meaning, and held a knife to its throat. We fled that night. We sold what we could, took a coach north, then another and another. We changed our names. We thought if we could just get far enough away, to a place like this, he gestured helplessly at the dark, enclosing cove. We thought we could disappear. He stood up abruptly, his body trembling with suppressed emotion. But you cannot disappear from them. Their memory is long. Their sense of offense, it is a living thing. They are here, Mr. Withers. I have seen one of them. In Whitby, last market day. He was just standing there, looking at me. And he smiled. He began to walk away, back towards the village, a figure of utter desolation. What will you do? I called after him. He stopped but did not turn. What can I do? I will wait. And I will pray that God, or the sea, or the cliffs, is more merciful than the black tortoise. I watched him until he was swallowed by the dusk, A man marching towards his own execution, knowing the date, the time, and the method, yet powerless to stop it. The pieces were now falling into a horrifying pattern. This was no legend. It was a slow, deliberate, and inescapable hunt. The confession I had wrung from Thomas Corbyn on the shingle beach left me in a state of profound agitation. The world, which had previously been governed by the sensible, if sometimes grim, laws of English society, now seemed perilously thin, like a painted scrim behind which moved figures of an older, more ruthless drama. The name, Tanaka, and the symbol of the black tortoise echoed in my mind, symbols of a power that operated with a cold, alien logic far removed from the squabbles of Yorkshire squires or the petty thefts of London pickpockets. I saw little of Thomas or Eleanor in the days that followed. A deliberate silence seemed to have fallen between us, as if he regretted his outburst and now sought to wall himself and his wife away from my prying eyes. I caught occasional glimpses of them. Eleanor, a swift, dark-clad figure with a basket, moving from the cottage to the village shop and back again, her head perpetually bowed against the wind. Thomas, walking the cliffs alone, his posture one of a man awaiting a verdict. The entire cove seemed to hold its breath, the usual susurrus of village life muted, as if the very stones knew a storm was gathering, though the skies remained a hard, clear blue. My own business was concluded, and I had no legitimate reason to linger. Yet, the thought of departing, of returning to the clamor of London with this terrible, unfinished story festering inside me, was intolerable. I invented pretexts, a lingering chill, a desire to sketch the dramatic coastline, and Squire Harcourt, though he must have found my continued presence peculiar, was too polite, or too preoccupied, to question me. It was on the fourth day after my conversation with Thomas that the storm finally broke, though not in the way I had anticipated. The event began mundanely enough. A carriage, a sturdy, unmarked black brougham, was seen negotiating the treacherous track into the cove, a rare and momentous occurrence. News of it spread through the village with the speed of a gorse fire. I watched from my window in the manor as it rolled to a stop not at the squire's gate, but further down the single street, outside the cottage of Thomas and Eleanor. 3 men alighted. Even from a distance, they were unmistakable. They were not large men, but they carried themselves with a stillness and an authority that set them apart from the slouching, wind-buffeted locals. They were dressed in well-tailored dark western suits, but the cut was subtly foreign, and they wore them with an unfamiliar formality. Their leader, who stood slightly ahead of the other 2, was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 40, with a face that was all sharp planes and calm intensity. His hair was jet black, slicked back from a high forehead. He did not look around at the curious faces peering from behind curtains. His gaze was fixed solely on the cottage door. This, I knew with a cold certainty, was Kenji, Tanaka's lieutenant. Thomas must have been watching for them, for the cottage door opened before they could knock. He stood there, framed in the doorway, a pale, defiant figure. I was too far away to hear the words exchanged, but I saw the bow Kenji offered. It was not a subservient gesture, but a measured, ritualistic one, a formality that was itself a form of threat. Thomas did not bow in return. He simply stood aside, and the 3 men filed into his home. The door closed, and for nearly an hour, nothing happened. The black brougham and its patient driver remained in the lane, an object of fearful fascination. When the door opened again, it was Thomas who emerged first. His face was ashen, a mask of stunned horror. He walked past the carriage without a glance and began to stride with a desperate, lurching gait up the path towards the manor. Towards me. He found me in the library, where I had retreated in a futile attempt to appear occupied. He burst in without ceremony, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes wild. "Withers," he choked out, leaning heavily on the doorframe. "My God. They're monsters. Their logic is a serpent's logic." "Calm yourself, man," I said, guiding him to a chair and pouring a measure of brandy from the squire's decanter. His hands trembled so violently he could barely hold the glass. "What did they say?" He drank the brandy in one gulp, the liquor seeming to steady him slightly. The fear in his eyes was now mixed with a kind of sickened awe. "Kenji," he whispered. He was polite. So terribly, terribly polite. He spoke perfect English, better than mine. He inquired after my health, after Eleanor's. He said the Oyabun, Tanaka, often thought of me and of my principled stand. The word was a curse on his lips. He said my refusal, while a breach of duty, was understood as a manifestation of my naive Western spirit. He looked at me, his expression pleading, as if begging me to comprehend the insanity of it. He said the original offense, the refusal to carry out Tanaka's will, still stands. It is a debt that must be paid. But they are offering me a chance to wipe the slate clean, to atone, and in doing so, to secure Eleanor's safety. A chance? How? Thomas's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. The Squire Harcourt. A cold dread trickled down my spine. What of him? Years ago, long before I was born, Harcourt's father was in the import business. He had a partner, a man named Tanaka. The elder Harcourt, in a dispute over a shipment of silk, publicly insulted Tanaka, accused him of dishonesty, and severed the partnership, leaving him with significant losses. It was a mortal insult to their family's honor. The son has inherited the father's debt. I stared at him aghast. The idea was medieval. That is absurd. The squire is an old man. He knows nothing of this. To them, it is everything. Thomas cried, his composure breaking. Kenji said the debt has been waiting, patient, for its time. My arrival here, my employment by the squire, he called it a fortunate alignment. The universe has provided the instrument for the settling of the account. He leaned forward, his face a mask of torment. They have given me a new vial. A different poison. Slower. More subtle. I am to administer it to the squire. In his food, his tea, I care not. They said it will appear as a wasting sickness, a gradual failure of the heart. No doctor here will suspect a thing. The sheer, patient cruelty of it stole my breath. They had not merely found him, they had found a way to make him the agent of their vengeance, to twist his morality into the very weapon that would destroy him. To save his wife, he must become the monster he fled. And if you refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Thomas looked towards the window, towards the cottage where his wife waited, unaware of the terrible choice being laid before her husband. Then they will kill Eleanor. Not quickly. Kenji was very specific. He said they would take her with them, back to London. He said a woman of such beauty and spirit would be appreciated, for a time. And when she was no longer appreciated, she would be given to the sea. And I would be left here, alive, knowing that my choice had condemned her to that. They will make me live with the consequence. That is the price of my continued refusal. He stood up, his body sagging with the weight of an impossible decision. They have given me 2 days. Until the new moon. He left me then, stumbling back out into the fading light, a man trapped in a web spun from a silk both literal and metaphorical, a web whose strands were duty, honor, and a love that was being used as a torture device. I remained in the library, the shadows lengthening around me. The genteel world of inheritances and afternoon calls had vanished. I was now a witness to a pact being made in hell, and I was powerless to intervene. The serpent had not only found its prey, it had coiled itself around Thomas Corbyn's heart and was slowly, inexorably, squeezing. The 2 days of reprieve granted by Kenji were a period of suspended animation for the entire cove, though only Thomas and I knew the dreadful cause. The usual rhythms of life, the cry of the gulls at dawn, the mending of nets on the beach, the slow procession of hours in the manor house, continued, but to my fevered perception, they seemed like the meaningless twitches of a corpse. The air itself felt thick, resistant to breath, heavy with the unspoken ultimatum that hung over the cottage in the dip. I saw Eleanor only once during this time. She was in the village, purchasing a few small items from the shop. She looked pale, her great dark eyes shadowed with anxiety she could not possibly comprehend in its full horrific dimension. She moved with a fragile grace, and when she spoke to the shopkeeper, her voice, as old Jeb had said, was indeed like music, but music from a minor key, touched with a profound sadness. She saw me and offered a small, hesitant smile, a ghost of the warmth that must have once animated her. I tipped my hat, my own smile feeling like a grimace on my face. How could she not see the abyss that had opened at her feet? Or did she, on some deep, wifely level, sense the tectonic shift in her husband's soul? Thomas, I did not see it all. He had become a recluse, no doubt wrestling with his angel in the claustrophobic confines of that clean, cursed cottage. I imagined him pacing before the cold hearth, his gaze shifting between the hidden portrait of his wife and the small, ceramic vial of poison that was the price of her life. It was a choice designed to damn him either way, become a murderer and live with the stain, or remain morally pure and bear the eternal guilt of his wife's horrific fate. It was a devil's bargain, constructed with a psychological cruelty that was breathtaking. On the evening of the second day, with the new moon a mere sliver of absence in the star-strewn sky, I could bear the suspense no longer. A sense of grim duty, or perhaps mere morbid curiosity, compelled me to act. I wrapped myself in my greatcoat and ventured out into the biting cold. I did not go to the cottage. I had no wish to witness the final, private moments of their torment. Instead, I took a position on the headland, concealed amidst a tumble of rocks that gave a clear, if distant, view of the cottage's door and the lane leading to it. The night was profoundly still and clear, the air so cold it felt sharp in the lungs. The only sounds were the endless, rhythmic sigh of the sea below and the blood pounding in my own ears. I watched for what felt like an eternity, my limbs growing numb, my resolve wavering. Had they already come and gone? Had Thomas made his choice? Then I saw them. They emerged from the darkness not as men walking, but as shadows coalescing into form. Kenji and his two companions. They moved with that same unnerving silence, their footfalls making no sound on the frozen ground. They stopped before the cottage door. This time, there was no wait. The door opened immediately, and Thomas stood there, a solitary candle casting a tremulous light behind him. He held something in his hand. Even from my distant vantage point, I could see the tension in his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders. He extended his hand, opening it. The small, white ceramic vial gleamed in the candlelight for a moment before he dashed it to the stone step at Kenji's feet. It shattered into a dozen tiny, glittering shards, the white powder within scattering like cursed snow on the dark stone. The refusal was absolute. Silent and absolute. A long, terrible silence followed. Kenji did not move. He simply looked down at the shattered vial, then up at Thomas. He did not seem angry. He did not seem surprised. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming a deeply held expectation. He spoke a few words, too low for me to hear, but their meaning was clear in the finality of his tone. He then bowed, that same formal, chilling bow, and turned away. His two companions, however, did not turn. As Kenji began to walk back into the darkness, the two men stepped forward. Thomas, perhaps expecting a violent reprisal then and there, braced himself. But they did not touch him. Instead, they moved past him into the cottage. I heard a single sharp cry, a woman's voice, Eleanor's voice, choked off abruptly. Thomas spun around, a cry of his own torn from his throat, and lunged back inside. The door remained open, a rectangle of ominous yellow light. For several minutes, there was no sound, no movement. Then, the two men re-emerged. And between them, walking with a strange, placid stillness, was Eleanor. She was dressed in a dark cloak, her head uncovered, her black hair a stark banner against the night. Her face was a pale, expressionless mask. She did not struggle. She did not look back. She walked as one in a trance, or as one who has already accepted her fate. Thomas stumbled out after them, his figure one of utter devastation. He reached out a hand, his mouth working, but no sound emerged. He took a few staggering steps after them, but one of the men half-turned, and though I could not see his face, the gesture was enough to freeze Thomas in his tracks. It was a gesture that promised unimaginable violence if he interfered. He stood there, a solitary, broken figure in the doorway, and watched as the three men and his wife were swallowed by the darkness. He did not cry out. He did not weep. He simply stood, his shoulders slumped, the light from the cottage framing him, until he seemed to dissolve into the shadows himself. I remained hidden amongst the rocks, my body trembling not from the cold, but from the horror of what I had witnessed. It was not a scene of dramatic violence, of shouts and blows. It was a quiet, efficient, and soul-crushing transaction. The threat had been executed with a precision that was more terrifying than any brutish attack. They had taken his heart, and they had left his body standing. The refusal had been made. The threat had been fulfilled. The long, patient vengeance of the black tortoise had entered its final, most cruel phase. And I was the only soul in all of Blackshell Cove, save for Thomas himself, who knew that the true horror had only just begun. For a long time after the dark procession had vanished, I remained crouched among the rocks, my mind a vortex of horror and indecision. The cold seeped through the thick wool of my greatcoat, yet I was numb to it, my senses overwhelmed by the quiet, surgical cruelty I had just witnessed. What was my role now? To go to Thomas? To offer what? Condolences? They would be as useless as feathers against a sword. To raise the alarm? To tell the constable that 3 foreign gentlemen had calmly escorted a woman from her home against her will? On what evidence? The word of a hysterical husband and a visiting Londoner with a fanciful story about Japanese honor and poisoned vows? I would be laughed out of the village, or worse, considered mad. In the end, a craven instinct for self-preservation won out. I retreated, stumbling in the dark, back to the dubious sanctuary of the manor house. I entered as silently as I could, the sleeping bulk of the building seeming to judge my cowardice. I did not sleep that night. I sat in a chair by my cold fireplace, staring into the grate, the image of Eleanor's pale, resigned face and Thomas's broken silhouette burned onto the back of my eyelids. The dawn, when it came, was a gray, reluctant affair. I descended to breakfast with a leaden heart, expecting to find the squire already discussing the strange disappearance, the village abuzz with gossip. But the great hall was silent save for the crackle of the fire. Squire Harcourt sat at the head of the table, perusing a week-old London paper, his expression one of mild boredom. "Good morning, Mr. Withers," he said, looking up. "I trust you slept well?" The mundanity of the question was jarring. Had he heard nothing? Seen nothing? "Adequately, thank you," I managed, my voice rough. "And all is well in the cove?" He lowered the paper, a faint line of puzzlement appearing on his brow. "Well, I suppose so. Why do you ask?" "I thought I heard some commotion last night. Down towards the Corbyn's cottage." The squire gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Oh, like as not a fox in the bins, or the wind taking a loose shutter. This old house plays tricks on the ears, especially at night. Mrs. Thwaite mentioned she had not seen the Corbyns today, but that is not unusual. They keep to themselves." The sheer, impenetrable normality of it all was more terrifying than any overt panic. The event had been so quiet, so efficient, that it had left no ripple on the surface of the cove's consciousness. It was a stone dropped into a bottomless well, heard only by those leaning directly over the edge. I could not bear it. Mumbling an excuse about taking some air, I left the manor and walked with a purpose I did not feel down towards the cottage. The lane was empty. The cottage itself looked just as it had before, save for the faint, glittering remnants of the shattered vial still scattered on the step. The door was closed. I knocked softly. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder. "Corbyn? It's Withers." After a long moment, I heard the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened a crack, and one of Thomas's eyes, bloodshot and wild, peered out. He looked decades older. "What do you want?" he rasped. "I saw what happened," I said, my voice low. "Last night." The door opened wider. He stood there, unshaven, his clothes disheveled. The interior of the cottage was in disarray. A chair was overturned, a cup lay broken on the floor. The scrupulous order had been shattered, just like the vial. "You saw," he whispered, a flicker of something, gratitude perhaps, that he was not the only witness to his nightmare, in his desperate eyes. "And you did nothing." The accusation was fair, and it struck me to the core. What could I have done, man? Fought them? There were 3 of them. They would have cut me down. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, the brief spark in his eyes extinguished. Yes. They would have. It would have been quicker. He turned and walked back into the gloom of the cottage, leaving the door open. I followed him inside. He sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. They have taken her, Withers. They have taken my Eleanor. I know, I said, my voice thick. We must go to the constable. We must tell the squire. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. And say what? That the Japanese mafia have kidnapped my wife because I refused to poison the squire? They will lock me in a madhouse. Or they will make inquiries, and by the time a letter reaches London she will be gone. He looked up, his face a mask of torment. Kenji's words. She will be appreciated for a time. Do you know what that means? Do you know what they will do to her before they discard her? I did not. My imagination, fueled by penny dreadfuls and travelers' tales of the Orient, conjured images of opium dens and silk-lined chambers of unspeakable degradation. The reality was likely far worse. Then what? I asked helplessly. What can you do? He stood up abruptly, a new, frantic energy seizing him. I can follow them. They cannot have gone far. They will have taken her to Whitby, to the railway. Or to a ship. I have a little money left. I can find them. I can get her back. It was the plan of a madman, a desperate, hopeless gambit. But it was the only plan he had. You cannot go alone, I heard myself say, the words leaving my lips before my better judgment could stop them. He looked at me, a faint, grim hope dawning in his eyes. You would help me? I was a fool. A romantic, meddlesome fool. But I was also the only person in the world who knew his story, who had seen the truth. To turn away now would be a cowardice from which I knew I would never recover. I will come with you to Whitby, I said, the decision solidifying even as I spoke. I have resources there. We can make inquiries. But beyond that, I cannot promise. It was enough for him. He grasped my hand, his own grip feverishly hot. Thank you. Thank you, Withers. We must go now. Immediately. He moved with a sudden, frantic purpose, stuffing a few belongings into a knapsack, a change of clothes, a small, leather-bound journal which he thrust into my hands for safekeeping, a miniature portrait of Eleanor. He wrote a brief, vague note for the squire, stating that a family emergency had called him away to London and apologizing for the abrupt departure. It would buy us a day, perhaps 2, before questions were asked. Within the hour, we were on the road, climbing the steep, muddy track out of Blackshell Cove. I looked back only once. The village lay below, nestled in its grim hollow, the sea pounding at its feet, shrouded once more in a creeping tendril of fog. It was a place that swallowed lives and secrets with equal indifference. We were fleeing its darkness, but we were fleeing directly into the heart of another, far deeper and more purposeful shadow. We were 2 moths, chasing the flame that had already burned us, and our flight felt less like an escape and more like a deliberate journey into the jaws of the beast. The journey to Whitby was a bleak and silent affair, a mirror of the desolate moorland through which we traveled. We secured a place on a farmer's cart carrying wool to the market, its slow, jolting progress a torture to Thomas's frayed nerves. He sat rigidly, his knuckles white as he gripped the side of the cart, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could somehow discern the shape of the black brougham that had spirited his wife away. The wind, which had seemed a mere nuisance in the cove, now felt like a pursuing fury, whipping across the open fells with a voice that seemed to whisper of failure and despair. I attempted conversation a few times, feeble efforts to formulate a plan or simply to break the oppressive silence, but Thomas was lost in a private hell of recrimination and dread. He would only mutter, "They will not have reached the coast yet. They will want to travel by night. They are creatures of the shadow," before lapsing back into his tormented vigil. The farmer, a garrulous sort, tried to engage us in talk of sheep prices and the unseasonable cold, but receiving only monosyllabic replies from me and none from Thomas, he eventually fell silent, shooting us suspicious glances. We were strangers, and our grim demeanor marked us as men involved in business of an ill nature. It was late afternoon when the cart finally crested a rise, and the town of Whitby lay sprawled below us, a jumble of red-roofed houses clinging to the steep banks of the River Esk, the ruins of the abbey standing sentinel on the east cliff like a broken crown. The sight of civilization, of smoking chimneys and the masts of ships in the harbor, should have been a relief. Instead, it filled me with a new kind of anxiety. The scale of the task before us was daunting. How does one find 3 foreigners and their captive in a bustling port town? We paid the farmer and descended into the warren of narrow, cobbled streets, the air thick with the smells of fish, coal smoke, and the tang of the sea. Thomas, who had been catatonic for hours, now seemed to awaken with a feverish intensity. His eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, scanned every face, every alleyway, every carriage. "We must check the coaching inns," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "The station. The shipping offices." "Thomas, be reasonable," I urged, placing a hand on his arm. "We cannot simply accost every innkeeper in Whitby. We need a strategy. We need to rest." "Rest?" He turned on me, his expression wild. "While they are taking her further away. While they are?" He could not finish the sentence, but the horror in his eyes was complete. He shook off my hand. "I do not need rest. I need my wife." He plunged into the crowd, and I had no choice but to follow. For the next several hours, we conducted a frantic, hopeless search. We visited the George, the Angel, every posting house of any note. Thomas's inquiries were blunt, frantic. "Have you seen a Japanese gentleman? 3 of them? With a lady, a beautiful English lady with dark hair?" The responses were uniformly the same: curious stares, shaken heads, and sometimes a slow, dawning comprehension that they were dealing with a madman. At the railway station, the story was no different. The ticket master had seen no one matching their description. As dusk began to settle over the town, painting the gray sky with streaks of bruised purple and orange, our desperation reached its peak. We found ourselves on the bridge overlooking the harbor, watching the lights of the fishing smacks twinkle on the darkening water. Thomas leaned heavily on the railing, his body sagging with a defeat so total it was painful to behold. "It is hopeless," he whispered, the words barely audible over the cry of the gulls and the lap of water against the stone piers. "They are gone. I have lost her." It was then that I saw him. A figure, standing perfectly still in the shadow of a chandler's shop on the opposite side of the bridge. He was not looking at the harbor, he was looking directly at us. He was one of them. One of Kenji's men. He was dressed in the same dark, western suit, his face impassive. And as our eyes met across the distance, he did not start or look away. Instead, a slow, deliberate smile spread across his features. It was not a smile of warmth or greeting. It was a smile of confirmation. The smile that said, "We see you. We have always seen you." I gripped Thomas's arm. "Thomas." "Across the bridge." He followed my gaze. The moment he saw the man, a strangled sound escaped his throat. All the despair in his face was instantly replaced by a white-hot rage. "You!" he roared, the sound tearing through the evening quiet. He lunged forward, scrambling off the bridge and onto the quayside, charging towards the figure. The man did not run. He did not even move. He simply stood there, smiling that terrible, placid smile, as Thomas closed the distance between them. Just as Thomas was upon him, his hands reaching for the man's throat, another figure emerged from the alley beside the chandler's shop. It was the second companion. In his hand, he held not a knife or a gun, but a short, heavy-looking cane. With a movement almost too swift to follow, he struck Thomas a sharp, precise blow to the side of his head. It was not a wild, brawler's swing, but a targeted, professional strike. Thomas crumpled to the cobblestones without a sound, his charge extinguished in an instant. I stood frozen on the bridge, my heart hammering against my ribs. The first man, the smiler, now looked up at me. He raised his hand and made a gentle, shooing motion, as if brushing away a fly. Then, the two of them turned and melted back into the alley from which they had come, leaving Thomas's motionless form lying on the cold stones. I rushed to his side. He was breathing, but unconscious, a trickle of blood matting his hair above his ear. As I knelt there, trying to rouse him, my fingers brushed against something that had been placed on his chest. It was another Netsuke. Another black tortoise. This one was different, however. In its mouth, carved from the same dark wood, it held a single, tiny blossom. The message was clear. The blossom was Eleanor. The tortoise had her in its grasp. Our flight had been a futile pantomime, our movements watched and anticipated. We were not the hunters, we were the mice, and the shadow of the cat had finally, decisively fallen upon us. They had not taken her away. They were still here, and they were playing with us. I managed to half-carry, half-drag Thomas's insensate form into the nearest public house, a low-ceilinged, raucous establishment called the Jolly Sailor, which stank of spilled beer and unwashed bodies. The patrons, a rough assortment of fishermen and dockworkers, fell silent as I staggered in with my burden, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I procured a room for the night from the surly landlord, overpaying grossly to secure his silence and his assistance in getting Thomas up the narrow, creaking stairs. I laid him on the lumpy bed in a room that was little more than a closet, its single window looking out onto a dark, reeking alley. The blow had been expertly delivered. It had rendered him unconscious without, it seemed, fracturing his skull. I cleaned the cut with water from a chipped pitcher, my hands trembling. The sight of the second Netsuke, now tucked into my pocket, felt like a brand against my skin. The tortoise with the blossom. It was a refinement of cruelty, a boast. They were not just powerful, they were artists of terror. Thomas awoke some hours later with a groan, his eyes fluttering open. Confusion gave way to a wave of nauseating remembrance, and he retched over the side of the bed, though his stomach was empty. "They are here," he whispered, clutching his throbbing head. "They never left." "No," I said grimly. "They did not. This was never about a swift abduction. It is a lesson, a prolonged punishment." "For what?" he cried, his voice cracking. "For refusing to be a murderer? For daring to believe you could refuse," I replied, the realization dawning on me with chilling clarity. "Your crime, Thomas, was not the refusal itself, but the act of defiance. You challenged their order. And now they are demonstrating, in the most intimate way possible, that their order is absolute. That you cannot run, you cannot hide, and you cannot fight." He lay back, staring at the water-stained ceiling, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "Then it is over. They will kill us both." "Not yet," I said, though I had little confidence in my own words. "If they wanted us dead, we would be dead. That man on the quay could have cut your throat as easily as he struck you with that cane. We are being herded, Thomas. But to what end? We spent a fitful night in that squalid room, starting at every footstep in the corridor, every shout from the street below. The world outside our door had become a hostile landscape, every shadow a potential threat. With the first gray light of dawn, we knew we could not stay. We were sitting ducks in that inn. "Our only hope is to return to the cove," I said, as Thomas forced down a piece of dry bread I had procured. "Return? To wait for them to come and finish it." "Precisely because it is the last thing they would expect," I argued, a desperate plan forming in my mind. "They believe they have driven us to ground here in Whitby. They will expect us to continue running, to scatter. By returning, we are moving against the current. And the cove, it is a known quantity. Its isolation is now our only ally. We can see them coming." It was a thin hope, a rationale built on sand, but Thomas, in his broken state, latched onto it. Any direction was better than the paralyzing uncertainty. We left the Jolly Sailor like thieves, slipping out before the town was fully awake, and began the long, weary trudge back to Blackshell Cove. The journey was a somber inversion of our frantic flight. Where before there had been desperate energy, now there was only a grim resignation. We said little, conserving our strength for the arduous walk, our eyes constantly scanning the empty moors for signs of pursuit that never materialized. It was as if our assailants, having made their point, had simply vanished back into the ether. We arrived at the cove as evening was once again drawing in. The village looked exactly as we had left it, locked in its timeless, sullen stasis. Smoke curled from chimneys. A lone fisherman was hauling his boat onto the shingle. It was a scene of such profound normalcy that our recent terror felt like a shared delusion. But the illusion shattered the moment we approached Thomas's cottage. Parked directly outside, sleek and dark as a beetle, was the unmarked brougham. They were here. They had not even bothered to conceal their presence. Thomas stopped dead, his face a mask of pure horror. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, questioning. My plan, born of desperation, now seemed the height of folly. We had not outsmarted them, we had walked directly into their hands. The cottage door opened. Kenji stood there, not as an intruder, but with the calm assurance of a host. He was once again impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable. He did not seem at all surprised to see us. "Mr. Corbyn." "Mr. Withers," he said, his voice smooth and polite. "Please come in. We have been waiting for you." He stood aside, holding the door open. It was not an invitation, it was a summons. The cottage, our intended sanctuary, had been transformed into a trap. We had nowhere else to go, no other move to make. We were checkmated. With a feeling of stepping onto the gallows, I followed Thomas across the threshold. The interior was once again in perfect order. The overturned chair was righted, the broken cup gone. The two other men were there, standing silently in the corners of the small room like living statues. And sitting calmly in the room's best chair, her hands folded in her lap, was Eleanor. She was alive. She was unharmed. She was dressed in a clean, simple gown, her dark hair neatly arranged. But her eyes were the windows to an empty house. They looked at Thomas, at me, but there was no recognition, no relief, no joy. They were flat, devoid of the vibrant intelligence that had so captivated me in her portrait. It was as if the soul behind them had been extinguished, leaving only a beautiful, placid shell. Thomas let out a choked cry and rushed to her, falling to his knees before her, grasping her hands. "Eleanor, my love, are you all right? Did they hurt you?" She looked down at him, her head tilting slightly, as if observing a curious insect. She did not pull her hands away, but she did not return his grasp. She said nothing. "Mrs. Corbyn is quite well," Kenji said, closing the door and sealing us in. "She has been our guest. We have treated her with the utmost respect, as befits a woman of her grace." "What have you done to her?" Thomas demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "We have enlightened her," Kenji replied, his tone conversational. "We have helped her to understand the nature of the world and her husband's place in it. The nature of consequence." He walked to the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your return is fortuitous, Mr. Corbyn. It saves us the trouble of a prolonged search. It also demonstrates that you are beginning to comprehend the situation. You cannot flee. You cannot fight. There is only one path forward now." He looked from Thomas's agonized face to my own, no doubt pale and stricken. "The original debt remains. The insult to my Oyabun must be answered. You have until tomorrow evening, Mr. Corbyn. The squire is hosting a small dinner. You are to prepare the meal. And you are to administer this." From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a third vial. This one was of a pale, greenish glass. "The task is unchanged. Your wife's life remains the currency. Fail, and the consequences for her will be vivid and final. Succeed, and you will both be free. The account will be settled. The shadow of the black tortoise will lift from you forever." He placed the green vial on the table with a soft, definitive click. It was the same choice, presented again in this nightmare tableau, but now rendered infinitely more horrible by the presence of the hollowed-out woman who was its prize. This was no longer a threat against the future. It was a promise built upon a present, living damnation. The ominous visitation was complete. They had not just found us, they had laid bare the entire, terrible machinery of their vengeance. And they had left us trapped within it, with the ghost of Eleanor Corbyn as our jailer. The silence that descended upon the cottage after Kenji and his men departed was more terrible than any outburst of violence. It was a silence thick with the unspeakable, broken only by the ragged sound of Thomas's breathing as he knelt before his wife. The green glass vial sat on the table between us, a malevolent jewel catching the last of the evening light. "Eleanor," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. He reached out to touch her cheek, but she flinched, a subtle, reflexive movement that was more devastating than a scream. Her hand, which he still held, lay limp and cold in his. "My love, it's me, Thomas. You are safe now." Her dark eyes, those windows which had once held such profound life, slid over his face without recognition. They were like the eyes of a doll, glossy and vacant. She offered no response, no flicker of the woman he knew. It was as if the essential part of her, the artist, the lover, the wife, had been scooped out and discarded, leaving only this beautiful, breathing effigy. A low, animal moan of despair escaped Thomas's throat. He buried his face in her lap, his shoulders shaking with silent, wrenching sobs. She did not comfort him. She simply sat, her gaze drifting to the window, to the gathering darkness outside, as if watching a play in which she had no part. I stood by the door, a helpless, horrified witness. The psychological brutality of it was beyond anything I could have conceived. They had not harmed a hair on her head, yet they had annihilated her. They had taken Thomas's reason for living and hollowed her out before his very eyes. The threat was no longer a future possibility, it was a present, lived reality. To disobey now would not mean her death, it would mean leaving her forever in this catatonic state, or worse, delivering her back to the architects of this living death for vivid consequences. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas raised his head. His face was ravaged, streaked with tears and grime, but a dreadful calm had settled over his features. The torment had not left, but it had been forged into a cold, hard resolve. He looked at the vial, then at his wife's vacant face, and finally at me. "There is no choice," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "There never was." "Thomas, you cannot," I pleaded, though the words felt hollow and foolish. "This is what they want. They want to make you one of them. To corrupt you utterly." "What am I?" he asked, his gaze returning to Eleanor. "A man? A husband? I am nothing if I cannot save her. Even if she is like this. She is still Eleanor. There may be a way to bring her back. The doctor something. But if I refuse, there is no hope. None." He stood up, his movements stiff, like those of an old man. He walked to the table and picked up the green vial. He held it up to the light, studying the unknown substance within. "They have won," he said simply. "They have taken everything from me. My peace, my future, my wife's mind. The only thing I have left to give them is my soul. And they can have it." "And the squire?" I asked, a final, feeble protest. "An innocent man?" Thomas's eyes met mine, and in their depths, I saw a chilling emptiness that mirrored his wife's. "Is he? Is any man truly innocent? He lives in comfort, ignorant of the debts his father incurred. We are all caught in webs not of our own making, Withers. His thread has simply intersected with mine. It is his misfortune." The moral universe had been inverted. The man who had once refused to poison a vile rival on grounds of conscience was now calmly rationalizing the murder of a kindly, if distant, benefactor. The black tortoise had not just broken him, it had remade him in its own image. He placed the vial carefully in his waistcoat pocket. "The dinner is tomorrow. I will need to prepare. I will need access to the manor kitchen." He then turned his attention back to Eleanor. With infinite tenderness, he coaxed her to her feet and led her to their bed. He helped her lie down, covering her with a blanket, speaking to her in a low, soothing monotone, as one would to a frightened child. She did not respond, but she allowed him to minister to her, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. I could bear no more. The atmosphere in the cottage was suffocating, a miasma of despair and impending damnation. I muttered something about returning to the manor and fled into the cold night air. The walk back was a blur. My mind reeled from the horror of it all. I was now an accomplice. I knew of the plot. I had seen the weapon. To not warn the squire was a sin of omission that would haunt me to my grave. But to warn him would be to sign Eleanor's death warrant, and very likely Thomas's and my own. I was trapped in the same ethical prison as Thomas, but without the desperate, love-driven conviction that could justify the monstrous act. Back in my room at the manor, I found no solace. The genteel surroundings felt like a mockery. I stared out the window at the dark, silent cove. Somewhere in a cottage down the lane, a good man was preparing to become a murderer, and his wife, the Muse, had become a ghost. And I, Alistair Withers, a gentleman of London, was standing by, paralyzed by fear and moral cowardice. The ultimatum had been delivered, not with shouts, but with the silent, terrible presence of a broken woman. And it had been accepted. The stage was set for a final, dreadful act. The squire's dinner tomorrow was no longer a simple meal. It was to be an execution, and the chef was to be the headsman. And I, it seemed, was to be a witness to that too. The long, patient shadow of the black tortoise was finally ready to consume its prey, having first ensured that the prey would willingly open its own veins. The day of the squire's dinner dawned with a false, crisp brightness. The sun, a pale, cold coin in a hard blue sky, did little to warm the earth, and the wind still held the bite of the North Sea. From my window, the cove looked deceptively peaceful, the grey stone of the cottages and the slate of the sea softened by the clear light. But the beauty was a lie, a thin veneer over the corruption that festered in the cottage by the shingle and in my own heart. I avoided the breakfast table, pleading a headache. The thought of facing Squire Harcourt, of making polite conversation while knowing the fate that was being prepared for him in his own kitchen, was more than I could stomach. I remained in my room, a prisoner of my own inaction, pacing the worn rug until its pattern was etched into my mind. My thoughts were a chaotic storm. One moment I resolved to go to the squire, to reveal the entire sordid plot. The next, the image of Eleanor's vacant eyes and Thomas's ravaged face would rise before me, and my resolve would crumble into dust. What was the life of one elderly, reclusive squire weighed against the destruction of two young lives, one already shattered, the other teetering on the brink of moral abyss? Yet, was it my place to make such a calculation? By staying silent, was I not endorsing murder? Driven by a need to see, to understand the state of the man who was to be the instrument of this tragedy, I left the manor in the early afternoon. I did not go to the cottage directly. Instead, I took a path that led along the cliffs above it, finding a vantage point where I could observe without being seen. Thomas was outside. He was standing motionless by his door, staring out at the sea, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as if holding himself together. Even from a distance, the tension in his frame was palpable. He was a man stretched on a rack of his own making. He would stand still for minutes on end, then suddenly pace a few frantic steps before stopping again, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. After a time, he turned and went inside, only to emerge a few moments later with a bucket. He began to scrub the cottage step with a frantic, obsessive energy, scouring away the last, glittering remnants of the shattered poison vial. It was a futile, symbolic act, an attempt to cleanse the threshold of the evil that had already crossed it and taken root within. He scrubbed until the stone was raw and clean, then stood back, his shoulders heaving with exhausted breath. I saw him then look up towards the manor, his gaze sweeping the cliffs. For a terrifying second, I thought he saw me, that our eyes met across the gulf of error and moral failing. But his gaze was unseeing, turned inward upon his own hell. He looked like a man already haunted by a ghost, the ghost of the man he used to be. I could watch no longer. My own torment was a pale shadow of his, but it was acute. I descended from the cliffs and, driven by a compulsion I still do not fully understand, I went to him. He was in the cottage, assembling his knives and kitchen implements in a leather roll. His movements were precise, mechanical, those of a professional preparing for a service. But his hands trembled slightly, and his face was the color of chalk. "Thomas," I said softly from the doorway. He did not look up. "Withers, you should not be here. I had to come. You cannot go through with this." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped him. "Can I not? Look at her, Withers. Then tell me I have a choice." Eleanor was sitting in the same chair, in the same position, her hands folded in her lap. She might not have moved all night. A plate of untouched food sat on a small table beside her. "There must be another way," I persisted, though the words sounded hopeless even to my own ears. "We could take her. We could flee, find a doctor, a specialist in London." "And how far would we get?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "You saw them in Whitby. They are not men, they are shadows. They are always there. They would take her again. And next time," he shook his head, unable to voice the threat. "No. This is the only path. It is the path they have laid. To step off it is to fall into the abyss." He finished rolling his knives and straightened up, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes were those of a stranger, hard, glittering, and full of a desperate resolve that had scoured away all softer emotion. "Do not try to stop me, Withers. Do not speak to the squire. If you do, I will know. And so will they. You will have her death on your conscience, and I swear to God, I will make you watch." The threat was cold, stark, and utterly sincere. The gentle cook was gone, replaced by this grim, determined executioner. The transformation was complete. "What can I do?" I whispered, defeated. "You can stay out of my way," he said, turning back to his preparations. "You can bear witness. And when this is over, you can take your manuscript and you can write your story. Ensure that someone, someday, knows what happened here. That Eleanor existed. That we existed." He picked up his knife roll and the small, green glass vial, placing them carefully in a canvas bag. He then went to Eleanor, kneeling before her. "I have to go to work, my love," he said, his voice softening for the first time, though it was laced with a heartbreaking artificiality. "I will be back soon. Everything will be all right then. I promise." He kissed her forehead. She did not react. He stood, his face a mask of anguish for a fleeting moment before the hard mask of purpose slid back into place. Without another word to me, he walked out of the cottage and began the trek up to the manor, a solitary figure carrying his own damnation in a canvas bag. I was left alone with the silent woman, the tormented soul who was both the reason for and the victim of the horror about to unfold. The weight of my complicity settled upon me, heavy and cold. There was nothing left to do but wait, and watch, and bear the unbearable witness, as Thomas had said. The dinner was to be at 7. The clock was ticking, each second a hammer blow on the nail of Squire Harcourt's coffin, and on the soul of the man who was driving it home. The manor house, usually a tomb of quietude, was possessed of a faint, nervous energy that evening. The squire, it seemed, had taken my continued presence as a reason for a small, impromptu celebration, or perhaps it was merely a lonely man's attempt at conviviality. He had invited the local vicar, a Mr. Lowood, a man with a permanently worried expression and damp, pink hands, and Dr. Mayhew, the village physician, a bluff, red-faced fellow who smelled of pipe tobacco and carbolic soap. It was a grim parody of a social gathering, a tableau of rural gentility staged on the brink of an abyss. I took my place at the table in the dining room, a long, gloomy chamber dominated by a portrait of some long-dead Harcourt glowering down at us. The air was thick with the smell of beeswax and the faint, cloying scent of the hothouse flowers arranged in a centerpiece. Every nerve in my body was stretched taut. I watched the door to the kitchen, a servant's entrance hidden by a heavy tapestry, as if expecting a demon to emerge. Squire Harcourt, at the head of the table, was in unusually good spirits. "A treat in store for us tonight, gentlemen," he announced, sipping his sherry. "Young Corbyn is a positive artist with a sauce. It is the one blessing of this accursed climate. It gives a man an appetite." The vicar murmured his agreement, while Dr. Mayhew launched into a story about a difficult breech birth he had attended on the moors. I could not follow a word of it. My ears were strained for any sound from the kitchen, any clue as to what was transpiring behind that tapestry. The first course was a clear broth, served by a nervous-looking maid. It was delicate, fragrant with herbs. I stared into the golden liquid, my spoon frozen in my hand. Was this it? Had he chosen this, the simplest of dishes, to be the vehicle? I watched the squire lift a spoonful to his lips, my heart hammering against my ribs. He swallowed, nodded in appreciation, and continued his conversation with the vicar. Nothing happened. The broth was clean. Relief, sharp and nauseating, washed over me. Perhaps he had not done it. Perhaps, at the final moment, his conscience had prevailed. The fish course followed, local sea trout with a sauce of butter, capers and lemon. Again, the squire ate with gusto, praising the perfect flakiness of the flesh. Dr. Mayhew devoured his portion with noisy enjoyment. I picked at my food, each mouthful like ash on my tongue. The tension was a physical pain in my chest. This agonizing suspense was its own form of torture. When would it happen? How would it happen? The main course was the centerpiece. A saddle of mutton, roasted to a perfect blush, arrived at the table, accompanied by a rich, dark gravy in a silver boat and a separate, smaller sauce boat of a vibrant, green sauce. Exclaimed the squire. The sauce vert. Corbyn's piece de resistance. A recipe from the continent, he tells me. Parsley, chervil, spinach, and his own secret ingredient. You must try it, gentlemen. It is extraordinary. My blood ran cold. The green sauce. The color of the vial. Thomas himself emerged from the kitchen to present the dish. He was dressed in his clean white apron, his face a calm, professional mask. But his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were those of a man looking out from the depths of a grave. He carried himself with a stiff formality, his movements precise as he carved the mutton with a steady hand. He did not look at the squire. The maids served the plates, placing a slice of mutton on each, and the squire insisted on ladling the green sauce himself from the smaller boat. A generous portion for me, he chuckled, spooning the vivid green liquid over his meat. The best part of the meal, I always say. I watched, paralyzed, as he cut a piece of the sauced mutton and placed it in his mouth. He chewed slowly, a beatific smile spreading across his face. Superb, he declared. Absolutely superb. The tang, the richness, there is a unique depth to it tonight, Corbyn. You have outdone yourself. Thomas, who had been standing silently by the sideboard, gave a stiff, shallow bow. Thank you, sir, he said, his voice a dry rustle. He did not elaborate. His part was played. The vicar and the doctor, following the squire's lead, helped themselves to the sauce. I alone left my mutton plain, claiming a sudden, capricious dislike for green sauce. No one remarked upon it. The conversation turned to parish matters and the state of the roads. I could not take my eyes off the squire. I watched for any sign, any flicker of discomfort. He ate heartily, drinking his claret and holding forth on the poor quality of modern horseflesh. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. He showed no ill effects whatsoever. He was the picture of health, his color even improving with the wine and the warmth of the room. A wild, impossible hope began to bloom in my chest. He had not done it. He had found a way to deceive them. The green sauce was just a sauce. The vial had contained nothing but food coloring. He had staged this entire performance to save his wife, bluffing his way through the ultimatum. The relief was so profound it made me lightheaded. The meal concluded with a simple apple tart and cream. The squire pushed back his chair with a contented sigh. A magnificent dinner, Corbyn. Truly magnificent. You have my sincere thanks. Thomas bowed again, his mask still perfectly in place. It was my honor, sir. He gathered his knives and, without another glance, retreated through the tapestry-shrouded door, back to the kitchen. The guests soon made their farewells, the vicar and the doctor bundling themselves up against the cold for their journeys home. The squire retired to his study with a brandy, still praising the meal. I was left alone in the grand hall, the supposed success of the evening hanging about me like a shroud. It made no sense. If Thomas had not administered the poison, why had he gone through with the charade? Where were Kenji and his men? Had they been watching? Were they satisfied? I needed to see Thomas. I needed to understand. I slipped out of the front door, intending to circle around to the kitchen entrance. But as I stepped into the freezing night, I saw a figure already hurrying down the path towards the village. It was Thomas, his canvas bag in hand, moving with a swift, purposeful stride. He was not returning to his cottage. He was heading towards the cliffs. The final night was not over. The true drama, it seemed, was only just beginning. The dinner had been but the first act. My relief curdled into a new, more profound dread. I pulled my coat tight and, keeping to the shadows, began to follow him. A sharp wind had picked up, snatching at my coat and whipping stinging particles of ice from the frozen ground. The clear sky of the afternoon had been devoured by a low, scudding blanket of cloud, and the first flakes of snow began to drift down, spectral and silent. Thomas was a dark, swift-moving shape ahead of me, his form intermittently obscured by the gusts of snow. He did not look back. His purpose was a straight line, leading away from the lit windows of the village, away from the manor, towards the wild, black expanse of the headland. He was not going to his cottage. He was not going to his hollowed-out wife. This, more than anything, confirmed my mounting terror. The dinner had been a feint, a performance, but for whom? And what was its true purpose? I followed at a distance, my boots crunching softly on the frozen turf, the sound masked by the rising moan of the wind. The lights of the cove dwindled to a faint, golden smudge behind us, and soon there was only the darkness, the snow, and the relentless thunder of the sea against the cliffs below. He led me to a place I knew from my earlier wanderings, a small, ruined stone shelter, perhaps an old shepherd's bothy, that crouched on the very edge of the precipice, its roof half gone, open to the elements. He disappeared inside. I hung back, finding cover behind a gorse bush crusted with ice, its branches clawing at the night. The snow fell thicker now, beginning to dust the ground in a thin, white shroud. I strained my eyes and ears, trying to pierce the gloom of the ruin. For several minutes, there was nothing but the wind and the sea. Then I heard it. A sound that did not belong to the storm. A soft, rhythmic rustle, like dry leaves skittering over stone. But there were no leaves here. It was the sound of silk. The sound of a kimono, or of the fine, tailored trousers of a Western suit, moving with a deliberate, unhurried gait. Shapes detached themselves from the deeper shadows within the bothy. 3 of them. Kenji and his 2 companions. They had been waiting for him. This had been the rendezvous point all along. Thomas stood before them, a solitary figure outlined against the patch of lesser darkness that was the seaward opening of the ruin. I could not hear their words, the wind snatched them away, but I saw Thomas gesture, a sharp, frustrated movement. He was arguing with them. Pleading? The green vial had been a sham. He had not poisoned the squire. He had defied them even after they had shown him the cost of defiance in Eleanor's vacant eyes. A surge of admiration for his courage, however futile, washed over me. Kenji's response was a study in stillness. He did not gesture. He simply stood, a pillar of calm in the swirling snow. When he spoke, his words, though inaudible, carried a finality that needed no volume. He shook his head slowly once. Then, one of the other men, the one who had struck Thomas in Whitby, stepped forward. In his hand he held not a cane this time, but a length of cord, or perhaps a thin leather strap. Thomas did not back away. He stood his ground, his head high. He had known this was the price. He had chosen it. The man moved behind Thomas. There was a brief, silent struggle, a blur of motion in the dark. Thomas's arms were pinned. I saw his body arch, a silent scream torn from him by an agony I could not see. And then, from the depths of the ruin, another figure emerged. It was Eleanor. She walked out of the shadows and into the center of the ruined shelter, her dark cloak flowing around her, her black hair loose and whipping in the gale. But she was not the catatonic shell I had last seen. Her head was held high, and her eyes, reflecting the scant light, blazed with a fierce, terrifying intelligence. She was not a victim. She was a participant. She walked directly up to Thomas, who had ceased his struggles and was staring at her, his face a rictus of disbelief and dawning horror. She looked at him, her expression not one of love or pity, but of cold, imperious judgment. And then she spoke. Her voice, carried on a freak eddy of the wind, reached me with chilling clarity. It was not her gentle, musical tone. It was harder, laced with an accent that was not quite English, the cadences all wrong. "The debt is paid, Thomas Corbyn," she said. "Not with the squire's life, but with yours. The insult of your refusal required a greater atonement than a simple death. It required understanding. You had to understand the weight of the order you defied. You had to see the world remade by its power. Thomas stared at her, his mouth agape, the truth crashing down upon him with a force more brutal than any physical blow. The kidnapping, the catatonia, it had all been a performance. A cruel, exquisite play staged for him alone. His Eleanor, his muse, his reason for being, was one of them. "Who?" he gasped. "All this time?" "From the beginning," she confirmed, her voice devoid of all warmth. "The exhibition where we met was not chance. The Oyabun required a lever. I was that lever. Your love for me was the weapon we used to break you. And now it is done." The man behind Thomas tightened his grip. Kenji gave a single, curt nod. Eleanor leaned forward, her lips almost touching Thomas's ear. Her final words were a whisper that the wind somehow delivered to me with perfect, cruel fidelity. The black tortoise does not merely kill its enemies. It consumes their world. She stepped back. The man with the cord completed his work. Thomas's body convulsed once, a final, violent shudder, and then went limp. They did not let him fall. They supported him, turning him towards the seaward edge of the ruin. I watched, frozen in horror, as the three men, with a strength that belied their stature, lifted Thomas's body and, with a single, coordinated heave, threw it out into the void. There was no cry, only the sigh of the wind and the distant, final crash of the waves far below, a sound that had been swallowing men and their secrets since the world began. The sound of silk rustled again as Kenji, his two companions, and Eleanor turned and walked away from the cliff edge, melting back into the darkness from which they had come, leaving the bothy empty, save for the falling snow and the echo of a betrayal so absolute it had shattered the very foundations of reality. The storm had reached its climax, and in its heart had been not thunder, but the sound of silk, and a silence more deafening than any scream. I do not know how long I remained crouched behind the gorse bush, my body locked in a paralysis of pure, uncomprehending horror. The snow fell upon me, dusting my shoulders and hair, its gentle touch an obscene contrast to the savage truth I had just witnessed. The wind howled its meaningless lament, and the sea continued its eternal, pounding dirge. The world had not ended. It had simply revealed itself to be infinitely more monstrous than I had ever dreamed. Eleanor. She had been the key, the pivot upon which the entire terrible mechanism had turned. Not a victim, but an agent. Not a prize, but a weapon. The love that Thomas had held sacred, for which he had been willing to damn his own soul, had been a fiction, a carefully constructed snare. The magnitude of the deception was so vast it felt like a physical blow to the head, leaving me dizzy and nauseous. When feeling finally returned to my limbs, it was as a violent, uncontrollable trembling. I staggered from my hiding place, my legs weak, and stumbled towards the ruined bothy. I had to see. I had to have some confirmation that the nightmare had been real. The small, roofless shelter was empty. The snow was already smoothing over the scuff marks on the earth floor. There was no sign of a struggle, no dropped item, no shred of evidence that Thomas Corbyn had ever existed, let alone met his end here. I walked to the cliff edge, my heart in my throat, and peered down into the black, foaming chaos below. Nothing. The sea had taken him as it took all things. It was the perfect crime, leaving no body, no evidence, only a story too incredible to be believed. I turned and ran. I do not recall the journey back to the cove. I remember only the burning in my lungs and the frantic pounding of my heart, a frantic animal desire to be within walls, under a roof, surrounded by the illusion of safety. I burst into the manor house, startling Mrs. Thwaite, who was banking the fires for the night. "Mr. Withers! You are covered in snow. Are you quite all right, sir?" she asked, her sharp eyes taking in my disheveled state. "The Corbyns," I gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "Have you seen them?" Her face closed off, becoming the familiar, impassive mask. "I have not, sir. And I do not expect to. The cottage has been dark since this afternoon." I pushed past her and took the stairs to my room 2 at a time. I locked the door behind me and stood in the center of the room, my chest heaving. The silence of the house was now pregnant with menace. Every creak of a floorboard, every rattle of a window pane, felt like a footstep, a signal. Were they out there? Kenji? Eleanor? Had they seen me on the headland? Did they know they had a witness? Sleep was impossible. I spent the night in a chair, a fire blazing in the grate, jumping at every sound. The face of Eleanor, cold and imperious as she condemned the man who adored her, was seared onto my mind. This was not the work of common criminals. This was a philosophy of vengeance, a creed that demanded not just the extinguishing of a life, but the utter annihilation of a man's reality before doing so. The black tortoise did not strike, it unraveled. With the first gray light of a bleak, snow-covered dawn, I knew what I had to do. I had to see the cottage. I had to confront the emptiness, to find some tangible proof of the horror for my own sanity. I waited until the village was stirring, then made my way down the lane. The snow had settled in a thin, pristine layer, muffling all sound. The cottage looked even more forlorn than before, a white cap on its sagging roof, its windows dark and blank. The door, as before, was unlocked. I pushed it open, my heart hammering a frantic tattoo against my ribs. The scene that met my eyes was one of chilling perfection. The cottage was immaculate. It had been scoured, top to bottom. The floor was swept, the hearth was clean and cold, the few pieces of furniture were arranged with geometric precision. All signs of human habitation were gone. Thomas's clothes, his cooking implements, his shaving kit, all vanished. Eleanor's few possessions, her brushes, her sketches, erased. It was as if they had never been there. But it was not merely empty. It had been sanctified. The air, despite the cold, was thick with the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood incense. And on the small, rough-hewn table in the center of the room, placed with deliberate care upon a square of black silk, was the final netsuke. This one was different from the others. The tortoise was not alone. Under one of its front claws, it held a tiny, exquisitely carved sparrow, its wings folded, its head bowed in submission. The message was unmistakable. Thomas had been the sparrow, crushed by the relentless, patient tortoise. I stood there for a long time, staring at that small, dark carving. There was no note, no explanation. None was needed. The empty, cleansed cottage and the silent, symbolic totem were a more eloquent statement than any letter could ever be. It was a declaration of finality. The account was closed. The shadow had passed on. I did not touch the netsuke. To do so would feel like accepting it, like becoming a part of their ritual. I backed out of the cottage, pulling the door closed behind me, the image of the tortoise and the sparrow burning in my mind. The discovery was complete. I had not found answers. I had found only a deeper, more profound mystery, one rooted in a culture and a code I could never hope to understand. Thomas and Eleanor Corbyn were gone, one to the sea, the other to the shadows from whence she came. And I was left alone, the sole bearer of a truth so terrible and so complete that it felt less like knowledge and more like a curse. The cove had swallowed another secret, and this time, it had left no body to wash ashore, only a perfectly curated void, and the ghost of a love that had never been real. The pristine, snow-blanketed silence of the cottage felt more accusatory than any clamor. I stood outside its door for a moment longer, the cold seeping through my boots, the image of the tortoise and the sparrow imprinted on my vision. Then I turned and walked back towards the heart of the village with a new, grim purpose. The horror was no longer a secret I merely kept. It was a poison I had to attempt to expel, if only to test the reality of the world around me. My first and most logical stop was the constable's office, a small, damp room attached to the back of the blacksmith's forge. Constable Miller was a large, slow-moving man with a kind, bovine face and a profound belief that most problems could be solved by the passing of time and a good dose of Yorkshire stoicism. I entered, the bell above the door jangling with a jarring cheerfulness. Miller looked up from his ledger, where he was meticulously recording, I later saw, the licensing of 2 new dogs. "Mr. Withers," he said, his expression one of mild surprise. "What can I do for you, sir? Not trouble with the squire, I hope?" No, Constable. It's about the Corbyns. Thomas and Eleanor. They've disappeared. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. Disappeared, have they? Well, that's a strong word, sir. I heard tell he'd left a note for the squire. Family business in London. The note was a ruse, I said, my voice tight with frustration. I saw him last night. He was in a state of extreme distress. And now they are both gone. Their cottage is empty. Cleared out. Miller steepled his fingers on his considerable stomach. Well, if a man's in distress and he has family business, it stands to reason he might clear out quick-like. Didn't seem the type to leave a mess, that one. Very particular was Mr. Corbyn. You don't understand, I insisted, leaning forward on his desk. I believe he came to harm. I believe he was murdered. The constable's eyebrows rose towards his receding hairline. Murdered? Here in Blackshell Cove? Now, Mr. Withers, you've been reading too many of those London papers. We don't have murders here. We have drownings. We have falls from the cliffs. We have men getting lost on the moors. But we don't have murders. What if it was made to look like one of those things? I pressed. What if his body was thrown into the sea? And who, pray, would do such a thing? He asked, his tone one of patronizing patience. I took a breath, knowing how it would sound. There were foreign gentlemen. Japanese. They had a grievance with him. They were here. I saw them. Constable Miller's face went through a fascinating series of transformations, from puzzlement to disbelief to a dawning conviction that he was dealing with a lunatic. Japanese gentlemen, he repeated slowly, in Blackshell Cove. Come to murder our cook. Mr. Withers, with all due respect, have you perhaps taken a fever? The weather here can play strange tricks on strangers. I am not unwell. I snapped. I am telling you what I saw. 3 men. They took Mrs. Corbyn first, then they disposed of her husband. And where is Mrs. Corbyn now? He asked, his voice infuriatingly calm. She was with them. So, let me see if I have this right, he said, lacing his fingers over his stomach again. You claim that 3 Japanese assassins came to our village, kidnapped a woman, then murdered her husband with her help, and then all of them, including the woman, vanished into thin air. And the only evidence is an empty cottage and the word of a gentleman from London who, by his own admission, has been under a great strain. Put that way, it did sound insane. The sheer, theatrical implausibility of it, set against the drab, solid reality of Constable Miller and his dog licenses, was overwhelming. I had no body. I had no witnesses. I had only a story that belonged in a penny dreadful. There is a carving, I said, a last, desperate gambit. In the cottage. On the table. A Japanese carving. He sighed, a long, weary sound. Mr. Withers. If every foreign trinket left behind was proof of murder, we'd have to hang half the sailors in Whitby. The Corbyns are gone. They left suddenly. It is strange, I'll grant you. But it is not a police matter. My advice to you, sir, is to finish your business with the squire and return to London. Put the sea air and these dark fancies behind you. I was dismissed, beaten by the impregnable wall of provincial logic. I left his office feeling hollowed out, the truth within me curdling into something shameful and secret. I tried others. I went to the Salmon's Leap, where the publican merely shrugged and said, strangers come, strangers go. The cove remains. I sought out old Jeb, but he was nowhere to be found, as if the village itself had withdrawn its one talkative source. The silence was not merely an absence of sound, it was an active force, a collective, unspoken agreement to forget. The Corbyns had been a ripple on the stagnant pond of Blackshell Cove, and the water was now smoothing over, returning to its natural, undisturbed state. My attempts to stir the depths were met with polite incomprehension or veiled suspicion. I was the stranger now, the one bringing disruptive, unpleasant ideas. Returning to the manor, defeated, I encountered Mrs. Thwaite in the hall. She looked at me, her gaze knowing and utterly devoid of sympathy. The constable was unable to help, sir? She asked, though it was not a question. He believes they simply left, I said, my voice flat. As did I, she replied. This is a place of endings, Mr. Withers. It is not wise to dig too deep into the soil here. What you might turn over is best left buried. She moved away, leaving me alone in the great hall. I looked around at the ancestral portraits, the worn furniture, the dust motes dancing in the slanted light. The village's silence was not ignorance. It was a kind of wisdom, a survival mechanism honed over centuries of living on the edge of a hungry sea. They understood that some truths were too dark to acknowledge, that some shadows, if stared at for too long, would stare back. By refusing to see the horror, they made it unreal. And I, the sole witness, was left clutching a truth that was becoming less substantial with every passing hour, a story that was fading into the salt-laced air, becoming just another legend of the unforgiving coast. The silence was not empty, it was a wall, and I was on the wrong side of it. The village's collective amnesia, its sturdy refusal to acknowledge the nightmare I had witnessed, should have driven me to madness or, at the very least, sent me fleeing back to London. Instead, it had the opposite effect. It forged my resolve into something hard and sharp. If Blackshell Cove would forget Thomas and Eleanor Corbyn, then I would become their memory. I would be the scribe of their tragedy, and to do that, I needed to understand the full scope of the web in which they had been caught. The silence was not a wall, it was a veil, and I was determined to tear it aside. I began my own investigation, a solitary and furtive enterprise. My pretext remained my lingering, fictitious illness, which allowed me to wander the cove and its environs without raising further suspicion about my motives. I started where all things in the cove began and ended, with the sea. I sought out the oldest of the fishermen, a gnarled patriarch named Silas who was said to know the currents and tides better than he knew his own children. I found him mending nets in a boathouse that reeked of tar and rot, his movements slow and practiced. I did not speak of the Corbyns directly. Instead, I asked about shipwrecks, about strange cargoes that had washed ashore, about foreigners. There's been strange things come in on the tide, he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. Crates of silk from the Orient, once. All waterlogged and ruined. And bodies. Always bodies. The sea keeps no secrets for long. Bodies of foreign men? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He squinted at me, his eyes pale and milky with cataracts. A few. There was one, 10, maybe 15 years ago. A young fella. Not from these parts. Looked different. Like he were from the East, but not quite. He had a queer little carving on him. The black turtle were tucked right into his waistcoat. My heart skipped a beat. A black tortoise? What happened to it? Silas shrugged his massive shoulders. The constable took it. Said it were evidence. But evidence of what? The man drowned. Like as not fell from a merchant ship. Nothing came of it. He's in the churchyard now, under a stone that says, a stranger. The sea gives and the sea takes away. This was it. A thread. A man connected to the black tortoise, dead years ago, washed up right here. I went to the small, windswept churchyard that clung to the cliff edge, its tilting headstones lashed by salt spray. It took me the better part of an hour to find it, tucked away in a neglected corner, a simple, rough-hewn granite marker. The inscription was eroded but just legible. The stranger. Washed ashore 1872. Requiescat in pace. Over a decade ago. Tanaka's reach was not just long, it was ancient. His grudges were patient heirlooms, passed down and executed with chilling precision. The sailor, I was certain, was the one the squire's father had cheated. The debt had been settled, just as Thomas's had been. My next inquiry was with the postmaster, a nervous, bird-like man who also ran the village's sole telegraph office. I claimed to be expecting an important parcel from London and wondered if any other such parcels had arrived recently, perhaps for the Corbyns. For the Corbyns? He repeated, adjusting his spectacles. No, sir. No parcels. But there was a telegram. Came from Mr. Corbyn about a month back. Very odd it was. Odd? How? It was just 2 words, sir. All the way from London. Cost a pretty penny, I shouldn't wonder. It just said, tide turns. Tide turns. Not a warning from a friend, but a threat from an enemy. A declaration that the period of safety was over, the hunt was beginning. It was the first move in the endgame, and Thomas, poor fool, had probably taken it as some sort of cryptic nautical message, a coincidence. He had no idea how literal and menacing it was. Finally, I went to the source of all local knowledge, Mrs. Thwaite. I cornered her in the pantry, where she was counting linens. I was done with subtlety. "The sailor in the churchyard," I said without preamble. "The one with the carving. He worked on a ship that did business with the Orient, didn't he? A ship connected to the Harcourts." She stopped her counting, her hands stilling on the stack of sheets. She did not look at me. "You are digging in a graveyard, Mr. Withers. You will only unearth bones." "The bones have a story to tell," I countered. "The sailor cheated Tanaka. The elder Harcourt insulted him. And Thomas Corbyn refused him. The black tortoise does not forget an injury, does it, Mrs. Thwaite? It waits. It watches. And then it strikes." She turned then, her face a grim landscape of resigned knowledge. "You think you are discovering something new? You are only tracing the patterns of an old stain. This cove, this house, they have always been touched by that shadow. The Harcourt's wealth was built on that eastern trade. The sin was baked into the stones of this manor from the start. The Corbyns were just the latest payment on a debt that can never be fully paid." Her words struck me with the force of a revelation. It was not that the village was ignorant. They knew. They had always known. They knew the price of the squire's comfort, of the roof over their heads, was a periodic tithe to a distant, unforgiving god of vengeance. The silence was a pact. To speak of it was to invite the shadow into your own home. The unraveling was complete. I had followed each thread, and they had all led back to the same dark source. This was not a single, isolated tragedy. It was a cycle. A recurring infection in the body of Blackshell Cove, one that flared up every generation or so to claim its due. Thomas and Eleanor were not unique. They were merely the most recent, and in Thomas's case, the most tragically deceived, victims in a long, cold war of honor that was being waged in the drawing rooms of London and on the cliffs of this remote English village. The horror was not an event, it was a condition, a legacy, and I now understood, with a sickening certainty, that my witnessing of it did not make me special. It simply made me part of the pattern. The knowledge I had unearthed did not liberate me, it imprisoned me in a wider, more inescapable cage. The horror was not a singular monster that could be slain, but a miasma, a poison in the very soil of the place. The legacy of the black tortoise was not a list of victims, but a pervasive, inherited fear that had shaped the character of Blackshell Cove itself. The villagers' silence was not ignorance, it was a hard-won survival strategy, passed down like a grim heirloom. To speak of the shadow was to give it power, to acknowledge its right to be there. By forgetting, by pretending the Corbyns had simply moved on, they were performing an exorcism by omission. I saw it everywhere now. In the way a conversation would die when I entered the Salmon's Leap. In the averted gaze of the fisherman who mended his nets where Thomas had once confided in me. In Mrs. Thwaite's grim, knowing resignation. They were all keepers of the secret, a secret so dark and old it had become a part of their identity, as integral to the cove as the sea mist and the crying gulls. This legacy of fear explained the cove's profound isolation, its resistance to outsiders. It was not merely geographical, it was a spiritual quarantine. They feared inviting in new blood that might, through ignorance or arrogance, attract the shadow's gaze once more. The Harcourts, the original sinners, were tolerated because their presence was part of the pact, the lightning rod that drew the storm. The rest of the village simply hunkered down and waited for the thunder to pass. I found myself doing the same. I began to see the world through their eyes. A strange cart on the road was not a welcome novelty, but a potential threat. A letter with a London postmark was not a connection to the wider world, but a possible harbinger of doom. The sound of the wind was no longer just the wind, it was the whisper of the past, carrying old grievances on its breath. My own fear began to mutate. It was no longer just a fear of Kenji or of Eleanor's cold, betraying eyes. It was a deeper, more philosophical dread. The realization that the world operated on two parallel levels, the one I had always known, of laws and manners and predictable cause and effect, and this other, hidden world, governed by an alien, unwavering code where an insult from a father could demand the son's life a generation later. This hidden world did not play by our rules. It exploited them. It used our morality, our love, our very sense of reality against us. What was the ultimate lesson of the black tortoise? It was that defiance was futile, that running was pointless, that the structures we build, love, community, law, are fragile things, easily unmade by a will that was older, colder, and infinitely more patient. Thomas's great sin was his belief in his own agency. He believed he could refuse. He believed he could run. He believed his love was a shield. And each of those beliefs had been systematically dismantled, used as a weapon to destroy him. I thought of the Netsuke left in the cottage. The tortoise and the sparrow. It was not just a message about Thomas. It was a universal statement. We were all the sparrow, living our lives under the looming, patient shadow of forces we could not comprehend, forces for whom our lives were merely moves in a game whose rules we would never learn. This legacy was now mine. I had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had not only looked back, it had imprinted its cold logic upon my soul. I understood why the villagers chose silence. It was the only power they had left. By not naming the horror, by not giving it a story, they denied it a part of its victory. They could not stop the black tortoise from taking its due, but they could refuse to build a shrine to its power in their minds. My business with the squire was long concluded. There was no reason for me to stay, and every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to leave. But a morbid fascination, a sense of dreadful kinship with this accursed place, held me fast. I had to see it through. I had to witness the final act, the closing of the circle. I had to know if the shadow would truly pass, or if it would simply settle back into the stones of the cove, waiting for the next generation, the next debt, the next sparrow to crush beneath its claw. The legacy of fear was not just the memory of past victims. It was the anticipation of future ones. And as I walked the cliffs, the wind tearing at my coat, I felt the weight of that anticipation settle upon my own shoulders. I was no longer just a witness. I was an inheritor. And the inheritance was a curse. A week had passed since the night on the cliffs. The snow had melted, leaving the cove a study in damp, miserable browns and grays. The official story, such as it was, had solidified into fact. The Corbyns, a flighty and unstable pair from London, had departed as suddenly as they arrived, leaving no forwarding address. The matter was closed. The village, having performed its ritual of forgetting, began to breathe more easily. The tension that had gripped the place, a tension I now realized was a communal hangover from the shadow's passing, began to dissipate. But for me, the silence was now deafening. The legacy of fear had taken root, and my senses, sharpened by terror, remained on a constant, futile alert. I took long, solitary walks along the headland, my mind a turmoil of unresolved horror. The image of Thomas's body arcing into the blackness, and Eleanor's cold, triumphant face, were my constant companions. It was on one such walk, with a thick, wet fog rolling in from the sea, that I saw her. I was standing near the ruined bothy, the site of Thomas's execution, staring out into the formless, grey void. The world had shrunk to a circle of visibility no more than 20 yards across. The sound of the sea was muffled, a deep, rhythmic groan from the unseen below. And then, a shape coalesced from the mist. It was a woman, her form indistinct at first, then sharpening as she seemed to glide over the turf. A dark cloak. Hair as black as a raven's wing, flowing loose. It was Eleanor. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, a statue of dread and fascination. She was not looking at me. She was facing the sea, her back to the ruin. She stood at the very edge of the cliff, a place where the turf crumbled into nothingness, a silhouette against the shifting, pearlescent gray. Was this her? Had she returned? Or was this a phantom, a memory given form by the fog and my own fevered imagination? She stood there for a long time, perfectly still. Then slowly she turned her head. Not towards me, but back towards the village, towards the cottage she had shared with Thomas. The profile was unmistakable. The pale, elegant line of her neck, the set of her jaw. It was Eleanor Corbyn. But what was the expression on her face? I strained my eyes, the mist swirling between us, obscuring and revealing by turns. I expected to see cold satisfaction, the stern countenance of the agent of vengeance I had witnessed. But I saw neither. What I saw, or what I believed I saw in those fleeting moments, was something else entirely. A profound, bottomless sadness. A regret so deep it seemed to have hollowed her out from within. Her gaze towards the cottage was not one of triumph, but of loss. Could it be? Had there been, buried beneath the layers of deception and duty, a fragment of genuine feeling for the man whose world she had destroyed? Had the performance, in some small, secret corner of her soul, become reality? Or was this, too, part of the act? A final, cruel twist for any observer, a ghost tailored to provoke exactly the questions now tormenting me? As I watched, trapped between the desire to call out and the primal fear of drawing her attention, she turned back to the sea. She took one step forward, then another, until her toes were at the very brink. My heart leaped into my mouth. Was she going to follow Thomas? Was this her atonement? But she did not fall. She simply stood there, on the edge of the world, a figure of immense solitude. Then, as silently as she had appeared, she began to fade. The thick tendrils of fog closed around her, swallowing her dark form until there was nothing left but the shifting gray and the sound of the sea. I rushed to the spot where she had stood. There were no footprints in the soft, wet turf. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I stood there for a long time, staring into the emptiness. What had I seen? A living woman, contemplating her sins and her loss? A ghost, forever bound to the site of her great betrayal? Or merely a phantom of the mist, a projection of my own tortured psyche, seeking a humanity in a story that had none? The encounter left me more unsettled than ever. It introduced a seed of terrible ambiguity into the clean, brutal narrative I had constructed. The black tortoise's victory had seemed absolute. But the look on that face, if it was real, if I had not imagined it, suggested a crack in their perfect, cold armor. It suggested that their methods, while devastating, were not without cost to the perpetrators. That even the instruments of vengeance could be blunted by the humanity they so expertly manipulated. Or was that precisely the lesson? That even doubt, even pity, could be weaponized to further torment the witness? I returned to the manor, my clothes damp with fog, my soul heavy with unanswerable questions. The ghost in the mist had not provided closure, she had shattered it. The story was no longer a simple tale of good and evil, of victim and predator. It had become something more complex, more haunting, and infinitely more personal. The line between truth and legend, between what I had witnessed and what I needed to believe, had blurred into nothingness, as formless and impenetrable as the fog from which she had emerged. The vision, or visitation, on the cliff was the final catalyst. The cove had shown me all its cards, its brutal, hidden truth and its equally potent, soul-eroding silence. It had offered me a place within its legacy of fear, a seat at the table of the willingly ignorant. I could, like Mrs. Thwaite and the rest, learn to see the shadow not as a monster, but as a natural feature of the landscape, like the winter gales or the treacherous tides. I could bury the story of Thomas and Eleanor deep within me, allowing it to petrify into just another unspoken rule of this place. Do not ask. Do not remember. But I was not of the cove. My roots were not in this salted earth, and the fear, while it had taken hold, had not yet strangled my will to leave. The memory of London, its noise, its crowds, its glorious, mundane predictability, became a siren's call. There, one worried about pickpockets and social slights, not ancient, transcontinental vendettas that consumed souls. There, a story like mine would be dismissed over brandy and cigars as the ravings of a man who had spent too long in the damp and dark. My decision to depart was made with a cold, clear finality. There was nothing more for me here but decay, both of the body and the spirit. To stay was to risk becoming a permanent resident of the headland, forever staring into the mist, searching for a ghost whose true nature I would never know. I informed Squire Harcourt of my departure the next morning. He received the news with his customary, detached politeness. "I am sorry to see you go, Mr. Withers," he said, though his eyes suggested a man relieved to see a disruptive element remove itself. "I trust your business here was concluded to your satisfaction?" "It was, Squire," I replied, the words tasting of ash. "My true business, the witnessing of a murder and the unraveling of a cosmic cruelty, was, of course, never mentioned." "Safe travels to you then. The coach passes the head of the track at noon." There were no tearful farewells. Mrs. Thwaite merely nodded when I told her, her expression as inscrutable as ever. "A wise decision, sir," was all she said, and I knew she meant it. I was a spark that threatened their carefully maintained tinderbox of forgetting. My departure was a relief. Packing my portmanteau was the work of minutes. The only item of consequence I added was the small, leather-bound journal Thomas had thrust into my hands on the night of our flight. I had not read it. It felt too intimate, too sacred. It was the testament of the man before the fall, and I was not yet ready to confront the voice of the hopeful, talented young cook, so starkly contrasted with the broken, would-be murderer he became. As I prepared to leave the room that had been my cell and my sanctuary, my eyes fell upon the writing desk. A final, macabre impulse seized me. I sat, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write. I did not write a letter or a note. I began to write this account. I wrote the prologue you have already read. I set down the date, the place, and my grim purpose. It was a vow, a promise to the memory of Thomas Corbyn, and to myself, that I would not succumb to the Cove's silence. I would be the record. I would be the witness they could not erase. The act of writing those first few paragraphs was like lancing a wound. A poison began to drain from me. The story, committed to paper, became external, something I could, in theory, close a cover upon and lock away. It was no longer just a screaming phantom in my mind. At 11 o'clock, I descended the stairs for the final time. The manor felt like a carcass, picked clean of all meaning. I stepped out into the cold air and began the arduous climb up the muddy track, my portmanteau in one hand, Thomas's journal and the few pages of my nascent manuscript secure in an inner pocket. I did not look back at the village below. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, on the moors, on the road that led away from the sea. When I reached the top, the coach was already waiting, the horses stamping their feet in the cold. I climbed aboard, nodding to the other passengers, a farmer's wife with a basket of eggs, a merchant from Whitby. Normal people with normal concerns. As the coach lurched into motion, carrying me away from that accursed place, I felt no euphoria, no relief. Instead, a profound and chilling emptiness settled over me. I was leaving the shadow of the black tortoise behind, but I was taking its essence with me. I had learned that the world was not as I had believed it to be. There were rules beneath the rules, currents that could pull a man under without a ripple. I was not escaping the horror, I was carrying its seed back into the world, a dormant plague in the pages of a journal and the memory of a ghost in the mist. The decision to depart was not an end, but a translation. The story was over in Blackshell Cove, but it was only just beginning for me. 20 years have passed since I left Blackshell Cove. The world has marched on with its relentless, industrial pace. The gaslight of my youth has given way to the electric glow of a new century. I have lived a life of quiet respectability in London, tending to my family's diminished affairs, a gentleman of no particular note. I married a kind and sensible woman to whom I have never spoken of the events in that remote coastal village. We have a daughter, whose laughter is the one pure light in my life, a light I fiercely protect from the shadows I know to be lurking at the edges of our civilized world. Yet, the Cove has never left me. It is the cold stone in my pocket, the constant, low hum of dread beneath the surface of my days. I have kept my vow. In the locked bottom drawer of my desk, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp and prying eyes, lies the completed manuscript of this account. I have written and rewritten it, striving for a perfect, clinical accuracy, purging it of the emotional terror that once threatened to consume me. It is my testament, my burden, and my secret penance. Thomas's journal I read only once. The hopeful, passionate voice of the young man, his sketches of recipes alongside tender descriptions of Eleanor's smile, was a torture so exquisite I could not bear to reopen it. I keep it with the manuscript, a relic of the man he was before the shadow fell. For many years, I watched. I scanned the newspapers for any mention of strange deaths, of Oriental gentlemen involved in peculiar incidents. I found nothing. The black tortoise, it seemed, had returned to the depths from whence it came. The fear, over time, began to lose its sharp edge, softening into a persistent, philosophical unease. Perhaps it had all been a bizarre, isolated nightmare. Perhaps the stress of that place, the isolation, had indeed conjured phantoms, and my rational mind had simply woven a grand, Gothic tapestry to explain them. But the seed of doubt, planted on that foggy cliff, remained. The memory of Eleanor's sorrowful profile would surface at the most inopportune times, challenging the clean narrative of absolute evil I had constructed. Then, just last week, it happened. I was attending a lecture on Japanese woodblock prints at the Royal Society. The hall was crowded with fashionable ladies and gentlemen, a world away from the desolation of the Yorkshire coast. As I made my way through the throng during the intermission, a man bumped into me. It was a gentle collision, but it carried an inexplicable charge. "My apologies," he said, his voice low and cultured. I looked up. He was a Japanese gentleman, impeccably dressed in a London-tailored suit. He was perhaps 50, his hair streaked with distinguished gray at the temples. And his eyes, they were calm, intelligent, and held a depth of knowing that stopped the breath in my lungs. They were the same eyes as Kenji's. The same eyes that had looked out from the portrait of Eleanor. He did not smile. He simply held my gaze for a moment that stretched into an eternity. In that moment, the 20 years fell away. I felt the cold wind of the cove, smelled the salt and the incense, saw the limp form of Thomas Corbyn. The fear returned, not as a memory, but as a present, living thing, coiling in my gut. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of greeting, but of acknowledgement. It was a nod that said, "I see you. We have always seen you." Then he turned and melted into the crowd, lost amidst the chatter and the rustle of silk. I stood there, frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Was it him? A relative? A mere coincidence, my mind conjuring patterns from the paranoid tapestry of my past? I do not know. I shall never know. And that is the final, chilling truth of it all. The shadow of the black tortoise is not a localized haunt, a curse confined to one miserable cove. It is a potentiality, a reminder that the world we have built, with its laws and its manners, is a thin veneer over older, darker currents. Their reach is long, their patience eternal, and their business is never truly concluded. So I leave this account for you, whoever you may be, who finds this hidden away. Read it and believe it a fiction, the overwrought fantasy of a troubled mind. Dismiss it as a legend. That is your privilege and perhaps your safety. But know this, sometimes the legends are true. Sometimes the ghost in the mist is real. And sometimes the shadow that falls over you is not cast by a cloud, but by a tortoise, black as oblivion, patient as stone, reminding you that there is no running, only the grim, uncertain hope that its gaze will pass over you and settle on another. The story of Blackshell Cove is ended. But the shadow remains, and its nature, like the truth at the heart of all the best horror, is forever, terrifyingly ambiguous.